Chronicles of the War of Souls Book Series. Book 1 Al-Marion, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 6. Al-Marion. The Survivors. Only a handful remained, a pitiful semblance of a squadron. 8 Centaurs and a scattering of humans, survivors of the Orc raids, moved through the steppes, heading towards the imperial capital. They were not fleeing. Each step came with immense effort, as if the earth had suddenly turned thick and viscous. They moved not in formation, not as a unit. It was a disordered, ragged cluster of beings, bound only by shared pain and a common direction. From each centaur and human alike emanated a quiet, almost tangible aura of suffering. The pain was a constant, gnawing thing, etched not just into their muscles, but into their very souls. It hung in the air around them, mingling with the smell of unwashed bodies, old blood, and despair. They were not warriors in that moment. They were walking wounds, stretched over skin and fur, living testimonies to how war, methodical and unhurried, grinds even the strongest flesh and most unyielding spirit into dust. The steppe, cold and indifferent, received them into its bosom, and the wind whistling through the grass seemed to whisper only one word: onward. And they went, because there was no turning back. Vrondar, the old warrior whose wisdom was etched in deep wrinkles on his stern face, now leaned on his spear as on a crutch. The shaft, polished by 1,000 touches in battle, now served only one purpose: to keep him on his feet. He no longer saw the road, no longer saw the horizon. His whole world had shrunk to a tiny, excruciating space. To the next step, to the unbearable, rusty heaviness that locked every tendon and every joint. All his will, the same will that had once directed entire squadrons into the thick of battle, was now devoted to one single, simple, and desperate action: not to fall here, on this god-forsaken patch of scorched steppe. Their progress could not be called a march. It was a slow, agonizing draining, drop by drop seeping into the scorched earth. What they dared to call a respite often lasted longer than a couple of hours. More often, the stops dragged into long, tortuous days, forcing them to set up a pitiful semblance of a camp on the burned, inhospitable ground. The inability to move on was more terrible than any pursuit, any visible enemy. To stop meant to pass a merciless sentence on themselves, that their wounds ran deeper, their exhaustion more dangerous than they had hoped. To stop meant to admit the bitter truth: they were no longer fugitives fleeing death. They had become cripples, doomed to a slow, creeping journey towards a salvation that seemed more illusory with each passing day. The moment they sank to the ground, the fragile shell of movement shattered, revealing the true state of affairs. Al-Marion didn't just stumble, he fell onto his forelegs with a dull, heavy groan and could not rise again. His mighty flank, bound in bloodied rags, radiated heat, and from beneath the dressing seeped not blood, but a thick, yellowish fluid whose sweetish putrid smell hung over the campsite, unmixed with the scent of dust and dry grass. It took long hours to carefully, moistening with the last drops of water, peel the cloth away from the wound. The wound was deep, gaping, and in its dark depths, the shadow of infection already stirred. It needed cleaning, but with what? Only with dry grass and patience. And the centaur lay there, biting his lips until they bled, his eyes dimmed with pain fixed on the gray sky, and only the trembling in his muscles and stifled rasps betrayed the hell raging in his body. Finn retreated into himself completely, into a mute, feverish stupor. He could not simply be given a drink he would not swallow. Chiron sat beside him for hours, dripping lukewarm water into his parched, cracked lips drop by drop, patiently wiping his chin. The stump, tightly bound with rough canvas, was inflamed and burned, and even a light touch made the young man thrash in delirium. It took time to change the dressing, to treat the festering with whatever they could find, sometimes leaves with pungent sap, sometimes just a clean, dry cloth. And all the while Finn lay there, pale as a wax candle, his breathing shallow and rapid, like a captured bird's. Thorion's broken arm in its makeshift sling swelled and throbbed with a dull, exhausting pain that made his vision darken. Alina, trying not to show weakness, sat down more often, probing her bandaged shoulder where a hot, living pain pulsed beneath the skin. Even Grim, whose strength had seemed inexhaustible, now moved with careful, deliberate slowness, as if afraid to jostle the deep bruises staining his flanks and back in livid purple-black. On such days, they did not move at all. They simply existed. Chiron and Alina would go foraging and return with meager spoles: a handful of fibrous roots, a couple of scrawny lizards. The spoles required time, long and careful preparation over a tiny, darely smoldering fire they were afraid to light by day. They ate in silence, unsated, merely plugging the hungry cramp in their stomachs. Water was worth its weight in gold. They drank it sparingly, in sips, stretching their supplies from the scant sources they could find. Muddy puddles and dried up riverbeds, drops of dew collected from tough leaves at dawn. The nights during these long days of stopping were especially terrifying. Without movement, the cold pierced to the bone faster. They huddled together, centaurs and humans, forming a living, trembling circle where one's warmth barely warmed another. Sleep did not come. It was stolen by pain, cold, and fear. They lay, listening to Lorien's heavy, wheezing breath, to Finn's delirium, to the pounding of their own hearts, which seemed too loud in the vast, indifferent silence of the steppe. In such hours, time stretched like thick resin, and every moment was filled with agonizing anticipation, not of improvement, but simply of the ability to take the next step. Only after a day, or even two, when Finn's fever slightly subsided and Lorien, gritting his teeth, could stand on trembling legs, would they gather themselves for the road again. The departure was slow, agonizing. Every movement came at the cost of incredible effort. They left the campsite not strengthened, but only slightly less helpless than before. And once again, they began their burdensome, infinitely slow journey, with a stubborn, animal desire to live another day, to take one more step across this endless, merciless land. Chasing a phantom hope, Thorian and Alina walked side by side, and their silence spoke louder than any words. His arm, broken and tightly bound with a makeshift sling of filthy cloth, and her shoulder, bandaged no better, were silent, visible testaments to the pain that had become their shared lot, and to the loss that had bound them in a silent pact forever. They did not look at each other, staring ahead into emptiness, but their steps uncertain, stumbling over every stone, were strangely synchronized. They seemed to move in a single rhythm, not from desire, but from an instinctual fear. To lose, in the surrounding chaos, the last point of support, the last living being who understood without words. And behind, bringing up the rear of this sad procession, trudged Gard and Elric, the old warrior from Proseca, his gait heavy and shambling. His weary eyes, like banked coals in deep sockets, never left his nephew. There was no tenderness in that gaze, only a harsh, unadorned light of cold resolve, a resolve to preserve at any cost this last sprout, this fragile shoot of life that had broken through on the completely scorched field of his own existence. It was not the look of a relative, but of a sentinel for whom duty had outlasted everything, even hope itself. It was Chiron, whose young eyes, not yet clouded by the burden of years and all-consuming grief, remained sharp as a falcon's claw, who first discerned in the west a dark, ragged line defying the steppe's faded tones. Forest, he exhaled. His voice cracked from thirst and fatigue like the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. Deep, old, at the foot of those hills, Vrondar slowly, as if each movement cost him incredible effort, lifted his head, his eyes, dulled by pain, fixed on the horizon. Forest means cover and water, Vrondar spoke, each word dry and desiccated as cracked clay in a dry riverbed. But in its shadow lies a different danger. Chose we have none. They turned towards the dark line on the horizon. With each step, the forest thicket grew before them, turning from a distant shadow into a dark, impenetrable wall. It seemed nature itself had erected a fortress here, living and breathing. Approaching closely, they saw trees ancient as the world's own memory. Pines and firs stood in a tight, silent formation, their colossal trunks, covered with lichen gray as an old mage's beard, several armspans thick. The air around them changed instantly. To dry, dusty breath of the steppe was replaced by a damp, thick coolness smelling of pine needles, damp earth, and decay, a sweetish, unsettling scent with notes of old blood and times long sunk into oblivion. They walked along the edge, their wounded bodies catching on thorny shrubs, until they found a spot where the ancient trees, as if taking pity, parted slightly wider, forcing their way through deadfall and thickets that scratched skin like 1,000 tiny, venomous daggers. They stepped into the green half-light. Sunbeams, golden and helpless, struggled to pierce the tangle of branches, illuminating only isolated patches of emerald moss and the ghostly, lacy shadows of ferns. Soon their hearing, sharpened by the oppressive forest silence, caught a new sound, a soft, persistent burbling. A stream, clean and cold, trickled between mossy, dark stones, its water seeming like liquid silver in this gloom. Here, a grin grunted. There was no relief, no joy in his voice, only a heavy, final statement of fact, blunt and sharp as a hammer blow on an anvil. Another stop. They had lost count of such halts in the past weeks. They organized the campsite quickly, silently, with the automatic, thoughtless precision that comes from extreme, exhausting fatigue. The Centaurs, overcoming the aching pain in their wounds, stood in a circle like living, breathing bastions, their spears pointed into the thicket, and their keen, twitching ears caught every rustle from the depths of the green gloom. The humans, unable to hold on any longer, simply collapsed to the ground, soft, yielding, and cool as a long-awaited featherbed. A Grim went to Finn first. The young man, limp and light as an empty garment, was carefully lifted from the Centaur's back and laid on the soft moss by the water's edge. Finn's eyes, clouded by relentless pain and feverish stupor, stared at nothing. Through the canopy of branches into oblivion. "Hold on," the blacksmith said hoarsely, dipping a filthy rag in the stream and running it over the bow's hot, grimy forehead. Water trickled in narrow, clean rivulets, forming intricate patterns on the dirty skin. "We'll rest. We must reach them. We must deliver the message." Thorian and Alina, moving slowly and carefully, as if gathering the pieces of a shattered crystal vase, somehow managed to build and light a small fire. The flame, timid and dim, greedily licked the dry twigs, and its flickering orange light etched their gaunt faces, blackened with ingrained dirt, soot, and mute despair. They sat around this tiny hearth, this island of warmth and life, unable even to speak, unable even to think of food, for there was none to be had. Each was submerged in their own unbearable pain, their own abyss, their own stubborn, hard-won resolve to reach the city, to reach it, even if they had to crawl the last mile on their bellies, grinding their bones to blood against the stones. And as they sat thus, in the deep, silent forest, drowning in the heavy burden of their thoughts, the thicket itself watched them silently from the gathering gloom. Darkness cold between the colossal trunks, like the columns of a temple even the gods had long forgotten. The forest was neither friendly nor hostile. It existed in a different dimension of time, where their suffering, their hope, and their fear meant no more than the fate of a fallen leaf or an ant crawling on the bark. This was simply another reality, ancient, indifferent, and full of its own unknowable secrets that whispered in the eternal rustle of needles, and were kept in the depths of souls saturated with the moisture of countless centuries. And ahead, hundreds of miles away, beyond endless rivers and hills, lay Al-Marion, not the shining city of the golden age from old ballads, but the last hope, dull and heavy as a leaden slat, a necessity pressing down like shackles. They carried with them not pleas, but evidence, evidence of blood that had soaked into the earth of their homes, and ash that drifted on the wind, veiling the sun. And now they had to survive to present this evidence, even if it meant chewing bitter bark and drinking rainwater pooled in leaf cups. The silence by the fire, broken only by the crackling of embers and Lorian's heavy, rasping breath, was unexpectedly torn by a quiet, strained voice, Thorian's voice, in which there was something childish, something lost. The young man sat, his good leg drawn up, his feverish, weary gaze wandering over the mossy trunks, furrowed with deep cracks like wrinkles. He peered at the intricate patterns of the bark as if hoping to find in them an answer, a solace, which did not and could not exist. A grim Thorian began and immediately swallowed the lump rising in his throat, mechanically adjusting the makeshift sling on his injured arm. A dull, nagging itch mixed with a deep, dragging pain emanated from beneath the dirty cloth. Why couldn't we turn aside? To that village we saw yesterday on the rise. There was smoke from a chimney or somewhere else to ask for bread, bandages, just a little. His words, weak and naive, hung in the damp, cool forest air. It seemed the very silence of the thicket listened to them with cold, indifferent contempt. It was not a Grim, bent over a torn strap of his hammer, who answered, but Vrondar, the old centaur, sitting on the ground and stretching out his wounded leg from under the bandage, where a slow ooze of blood and pus seep turned his heavy, grizzled head towards the youth with visible effort. His eyes, deep-set and ringed with dark, bluish circles, were full not of reproach, but of a harsh, hard-won truth that proved heavier than any rebuke. Who knows what's happening in those villages now, lad, he said, and his hoarse, dehydrated voice cut the silence like a dull, serrated blade. The plague spreads like a bloodstain on wet wool. Yesterday's friendly neighbor might lie with a slit throat today, and strangers already sit on his hearth, burning the last of his stores. If we stumbled on a patrol, even a small one, he meaningfully, slowly swept his gaze over their wretched camp. The wounded, barely standing centaurs, the crippled Finn whose breathing was like a quiet, continuous moan. The fight would be our last. And our task now is not a heroic death. It is to deliver the word, before it's too late for all. Before Al-Marion shares the fate of your village. A grim, mending a torn strap by the fire, grunted darkly without looking up. His powerful shoulders tensed under the rough, sweat-stained fabric of his shirt. He's right. His bass voice sounded hollow and abrupt, like a hammer blow in an empty, abandoned forge. They won't understand us. They'll take us for looters, for deserters, or worst, for harbingers of doom not to be let past the threshold. Right now, we are a shadow, a ghost from which eyes avert, and we must remain so, until we reach it. Until we stand before its gates. Thorian nodded silently, staring at the smoldering embers, in whose crimson depths he seemed to see the glimmer of a distant, all-consuming fire. Youthful, naive hope for simple help, for bread and a roof, for human compassion slowly died in his eyes, replaced by a bitter, cold understanding, as cold as the water of this forest stream. Their solitude was now their only armor, their chainmail and their curse all at once. Vrondar rose heavily, with a muffled groan that seemed to come from deep in his chest. Leaning on his spear, which had become an extension of his body. Hunger doesn't wait, and wounds won't heal on an empty stomach. His gaze, heavy and damp, slid over the few still capable of staying on their feet. Chiron, Alina West, along the stream. Look for roots, mushrooms, anything edible. Keep your eyes open. Guard. Take your nephew. Circle the edge. Check for berries. Maybe find a wild nest. The rest guard and camp. Not a step into the thicket. The orders were given quietly, without vigor, without the internal energy that usually precedes any task. This was not a hunt, but a grim, necessary procedure, painful and methodical, like dressing a deep wound. A grim stayed by the fire with Finn and the gravely wounded Lorien, whose breathing had grown a little quieter, but no less eerie and ragged for it. He laid his mighty, scar-etched palm on the young man's shoulder. Finn seemed to be dozing, but his one remaining hand convulsively, with insane, frantic strength, clutched the edge of his dirty, tattered cloak. "We'll break through, lad," the blacksmith muttered, staring into the void veiled by the gray forest haze. "We will break through." And the party, as best they could, dispersed, dissolving into the green, deceptive half-light of the deep forest, beginning their quiet, desperate search for sustenance, a mouthful of life, a crumb of strength that would allow them to take the next step, and then another, on this endless road to the distant, unknown, and perhaps no longer existing great Al-Marion. The party returned to the fire with a meager, beggarly haul, but for them, exhausted to the last degree, it was a treasure, a gift from the gods themselves. Alina and Chiron brought an armful of tail, fibrous roots and a handful of pale, lichen-like mushrooms smelling of dampness and earth. Guard and Alaric found a few crushed handfuls of sour, astringent forest berries and a couple of small, speckled bird eggs, carefully, tenderly wrapped in a cloth as if they were precious gems. But the main stroke of luck, the one that even made a grim stony face twitch, was brought by Chiron at the edge of a clearing where the forest thinned. He managed to shoot a skinny, skeletal old hare with his bow, its hide stretched tight over its ribs. The haul was modest, pitiful, but the mere sight of the dark, stringy meat, even in such small quantity, made their eyes, dulled and weary, flare briefly with a dim but living fire, while a grim, squatting by the stream, skinned the carcass, his iron-hardened fingers deftly separating hide from flesh, and Guard carefully hung it over the hottest part of the fire, on a makeshift spit. A fragile semblance of hope, as brittle as those eggs in the cloth, reigned in the camp. The smell of roasting meat, wild, primal, and incredibly desirable, mixed with bitter smoke, drifted between the trees, filling the damp, bare. It was so longed for and so dangerous in this wilderness, that everyone peered into the surrounding darkness, fearing the scent would attract not only them, the surviving humans and centaurs, but someone else whose attention they did not need at all. It was this smell, wild, enticing, that drew attention, becoming a beacon in the silent kingdom of moss and ancient trees. At first, no one noticed anything, for fatigue filled them like heavy lead. Then Chiron, whose hearing, honed on the endless steppes, was sharper than a human's and finer than an elf's, grew alert, freezing in place. His wide nostrils flared, taking in the air, and his ears, covered in short fur, turned like locators, catching an invisible, unformed threat. The equine part of his body shifted restlessly from foot to foot, crushing the damp moss. "Quiet," he whispered, and his strained voice held not just alarm, but the primal wariness that precedes either flight or death. All froze, and life itself seemed to stop its flow within them. Even Finn, whose consciousness swam in a fog of pain and fever, raised his head, and his gaze, cloudy and detached, became strangely focused, as if the instinct for self-preservation had pierced the veil of suffering. Vrondar, overcoming the shooting pain in his leg, slowly, with the majestic dignity of a doomed warrior, rose to his full towering height, and his fingers, dry and gnarled, gripped the spear shaft so tightly his knuckles whitened. Grim silently, with the caution of a hunter rather than a blacksmith, set down the bloodied knife and took up his hammer, its familiar weight seeming both a comfort and a curse in that moment. The silence in the forest changed its nature. The familiar, lulling rustles, the chirping of unseen birds, the crack of twigs under weightless paws all vanished. Now it was a ringing, thick silence, laden with hidden, unspoken threat, like a goblet of dark wine ready to overflow. Somewhere in the thicket, behind the impenetrable wall of trees and tangled vines, came a soft, barely perceptible but weighty rustle as if something large, strong, and heavy was stepping cautiously, with predatory grace, over a crunchy deadfall. Then another, closer, to the right, and another to the left, completing a half-circle. They saw no one, only impassive trunks, tatters of hanging moss, and impenetrable greenish gloom that began just 2 paces from the fire. But all of them humans with their hearts pounding like trapped birds, and centaurs with their nature granted might felt it on their backs, as cold, unpleasant shivers running under their skin. They were being watched. Dozens of invisible, ruthless eyes from the green darkness studied them, assessed their weaknesses, calculated their chances. The air, recently filled with the saltific smell of foo and smoke, now seemed thick and heavy, as before a storm, and each breath came with effort. Alina, overcoming the dull, nagging pain in her bandaged shoulder, silently, with a movement practiced over years of traveling life, drew the string of her bow, knocking an arrow with a dark, deadly tit. Her eyes, cold and clear as a mountain lake, scanned the thicket, searching for the slightest movement, a shadow within a shadow. Thorian pressed his back against her warm, trembling side, clutching a short hunting knife in his one good but shaking hand. His face was pale as linen, but his lips were pressed into a thin, resolute white line, betraying not childish fear, but the grim necessity to survive. Vrondar stood motionless as a storm-weathered rock, his own wound forgotten, discarded as unnecessary. He did not take his eyes off the direction of the rustling, and in his clouded eyes burned an old, familiar fire, the fire of will defying fate. Stand ready, his voice sounded quietly, but with an indisputable firmness that compels obedience even in the face of death. They are here. Who they were he did not say. There was no need. Each understood, guessed, felt it in their gut. Their small, fragile, eggshell-thin camp, their respite bought at such an unimaginably high price, was over. The forest that had given them water and temporary shelter was now preparing to present its bill, ancient and merciless, and that bill, judging by the increasing, frighteningly silent approach of the unseen, might be the last one in their short, broken-off lives. The tension reached its peak when the string of Alina's bow was drawn to its limit. Grim's muscles tensed for a crushing blow, and Vrondar was ready to give the order for a desperate, suicidal charge. But at that moment, slicing through the oppressive silence, a voice came from the very heart of the thicket. Not loud, not furious, but piercingly clear, like the strike of a tiny crystal bell. It sounded in the common tongue but with a light, lilting, soaring elven accent that made each word hollow and resonant. Lower your weapons. Had we wished you dead, you would not be breathing. All froze, paralyzed by this voice, which held neither threat nor comfort, only a cold statement of indisputable fact. Vrondar's gaze shot to a grim, and a whole silent conversation, full of doubt, fury, and a heavy chose, passed between them. In the blacksmith's eyes, a war raged between the blind rage of a cornered beast and sober, bitter common sense. A second stretched into eternity, measured by the beats of their parched hearts. Finally, Vrondar slowly, almost imperceptibly nodded, and his own spear, the symbol of his warrior's honor, touched the ground with a dull thud. A grim, his face contorted in a grimace of submission and rage, dropped his hammer with a deep, visceral thud that left a dent in the soft earth. Alina, not taking her cold, distrustful eyes off the motionless thicket, smoothly eased the bowstring, and the arrow slid back into the quiver with a quiet hiss. One by one, with hearts heavy as lead, they laid down their pitiful but only weapons. It was not a surrender, not an admission of defeat, but a gesture of extreme, desperate necessity. A step into the blind, dark abyss of forced trust. And then the forest came alive, but in a different way. They emerged from the green gloom soundlessly, as if shadows materializing from the very air. From the play of light and dark under the canopy of ancient crowns. First 2, then 5, and soon there were 12 of them. Trackers, forest wardens. Their appearance was simultaneously beautiful, honed like a blade, and for that very reason frightening in its unnatural, otherworldly perfection. Tall, with athletic, lean builds, they combine a human, rough-hewn power with refined, timeless elven grace. From beneath simple, but impeccably crafted cloaks the color of moss and twilight, glimpses of armor made of dark, polished leather could be seen, inlaid with the muted gleam of a pale metal like mithril. Elongated ears, slightly rounded at the tips, betrayed their mixed, uncanny blood. But most striking, most soul-piercing, were their eyes the color of old, dull gold, deep dark copper, or cold, polished steel, all with narrow, vertical slits for pupils, like those of predatory cats caught unawares. In the forest gloom, they glowed faintly, emitting a cold, ruthless, analytical light that seemed to see not the surface, but the very essence, all fears and all weaknesses. Their hair, shades from ashen gray to raven's wing, was braided in intricate, tight warrior braids, interwoven with thin leather strips bearing carved runic symbols, whose meaning was hidden from outsiders. They stood in a half-circle, silent and motionless, statues carved from the very essence of the forest, and from them emanated the chill of ancient stones and deep, sunless caves. Their gazes, heavy and piercing as honed daggers, slid over the weary, maimed travelers, searching for something, assessing every detail: the caked dirt on their clothes, ingrained in the pores of their skin, the brown bloodstains on makeshift bandages, the hollow, inward-turned stares, the ghastly stump of Finn's arm pressed to his chest. In their silence, thick as tar, one read not hostility, but not friendliness either, rather a cold, detached, almost predatory scrutiny, as if they were observing curious, half-dead beasts that had strayed into their domain. Finally, one of them, the one standing at the center, stepped forward. His bearing, the invisible authority radiating from his every motion, and the way the others inclined their heads slightly made his status clear. The leader, the alpha of this pack of shadows, his face, with sharp, stark features as if chiseled from granite, was marked by a couple of old, whitish scars that only emphasized his inhuman, aloof beauty. Eyes the color of dark, almost black copper slowly, unhurriedly swept over their wretched camp, lingering on the extinguished fire, the discarded weapons, on hands trembling with tension. You carry the reek of smoke and blood, he spoke, and his voice was quiet. But each word fell into the ringing silence with the weight and clarity of a polished stone. And not only your own. You flee from the east, from those places where the earth burns and water turns bitter. It was not a question, but a statement of a joyless, obvious fact, delivered with ruthless precision. A grim, feeling it was his turn to speak, that silence could be interpreted as weakness or deceit, took a heavy step forward, trying to straighten his tired, burden-bent back. We bear word, he rasped, and his hoarse, strained voice held all the accumulated bitterness, weariness, and rage of a cornered wolf. Word of the fall of the far bank, Proseka, and perhaps all the eastern marches. Orcs and Vargs march to war, led by one they call the Iron Shaman. At these words, as if from a sudden gust of icy wind, something shifted in the trackers' stances. Not the tension of readiness for battle, but rather a grim, heavy foreboding finding its terrible confirmation. The copper eyes of their leader narrowed, the vertical pupils becoming thin as honed blades ready to pierce an invisible enemy. The Iron Shaman, he spoke the name with a cold, age-hardened hatred, but deep in his voice, like a crack in granite, sounded both alarm and an understanding of the scale of the calamity. We have heard that name, in whispers, in warnings that creep from beyond the steppes. Fear travels swifter than wind across the land. We were heading east ourselves to verify these rumors. His gaze, heavy and penetrating, slid again, this time more intently, over Finn's death-pale face, over the stump bound in rough canvas, absorbing all the horror etched in their hunched postures, in every festering wound. But it seems the truth has overtaken you before we could. Tell us everything you know, from the beginning. And this was no longer just an order or a request. It was a demand born of a shared, looming threat, a demand for a sacrifice laid on the altar of survival. For the first time in many days and nights of grueling, desperate flight, they had met those who did not turn away, did not slam gates, but listened. Those who understood the ancient, universal language of blood, fear, and ash. The first, fragile, and thorny bridge of trust had been thrown across the abyss of their despair. Perhaps they had found not just temporary shelter, but allies who had long been watching the same darkness advancing from the east. A Grimm began to speak, at first slowly, with difficulty, choosing words scorched by smoke and pain, dredging them from the depths of his wounded memory. He spoke of the pre-dawn mist over the far bank, of the last peaceful morning, of the first, piercing strike of the alarm bell shattering sleep. His voice, rough and unused to long speeches, broke into a rasp when he reached the destruction of Boren's mill, of how Lodi was led away into the smoke and screams. Then Vrondar took up the tale. His low, subterranean rumble, like a distant rockslide, complemented the account, giving it scope and strategic, all-consuming horror. He described not just a furious raid, but a systematic, unstoppable invasion, an iron tide sweeping away everything in its path, leaving no mercy for elders or centaurs. He spoke of his kin, fallen at the walls of Proseca, of the silent, methodical cruelty of the Orcs, and of the crimson, sky-devouring blaze over the Black Hills. Thorian, when he spoke, his voice dropping to a whisper like the rustle of dry leaves, told of the last Hall Tavern, of the door crashing in, and of the hoarse, guttural cry of alive. From one of the Orcs, he looked at no one, staring at the ground between his worn boots, but his hand clenched into a white-knuckled fist spoke of loss and fury more eloquently than any, even the bitterest, words. Finn said nothing. He simply sat, leaning back on the soft moss, and his silence, his glassy, inward-turned stare, and the convulsive shudder that occasionally ran through his body, were the most terrible and irrefutable testimony of all. The trackers listened without interrupting, without moving, absorbing every word, every fragment of sound. Their stone-carved faces remained impassive, but deep in their glowing, predatory eyes, flashes of the very nightmare they were being so meticulously and mercilessly described flicker and die. When a Grimm, rasping and catching his breath, finally finished with the last, desperate decision to go to distant Al-Marion, a heavy, thick silence fell, in which only the icy whisper of the stream and the loud, stifled beating of their own hearts could be heard. The leader of the trackers, whose name was Daryl, slowly, with the deliberate gravity of a man accustomed to weighing not just words, but the most hidden thoughts, transferred his heavy gaze from one gaunt face to another, lingering on each as if reading entire chronicles of pain and loss on their darkened skin. His eyes, the color of old, patinate copper with narrow-slit pupils, seemed to absorb not only the spoken words, but the very essence of suffering, that invisible aura of despair emanating from these fugitives, mingling with the smell of pus, sweat, and smoke. "You did the only right thing you could," he said at last, and his low voice, devoid of elven lilt, held the echo of a stern, soldierly approval, without a trace of weakness or regret, to bring word and warning to the capital. But your testimony alone, however terrible and sincere, will not be enough for the palace halls. He threw a sharp, scathing glance westward, in the direction where, by his knowledge, Al-Marion must lie, and in that glance was the deepest contempt. The Council of Lords in the capital is mired in intrigue like pigs in filth. They hear only the whispers of sycophants and the clink of their own coins. They need not the words of survivors from the marches, not stories reeking of blood, the proof that cannot be dismissed as children's tales. The Empire is not what it was. His gaze, cold and analytical, returned to them, lingering on the crusted, bloodied rags serving as bandages, on Thorian's sunken, blue-tinged cheeks, on the feverish, unhealthy gleam in Finn's eyes, which reflected the firelight but held no life. First, the wounds, then, food. "You will not reach the city walls if your bones remain in this forest," he stated with ruthless, surgical bluntness, that of a seasoned soldier who had seen hundreds of deaths. "Our goal is one. Your word is bound to our duty, which we cannot ignore." He turned to his people, and a few short, guttural, melody-less words in that mixed borderland dialect fell from his thin, tightly pressed lips. There was no fuss, no haste in the tracker's movements, only an instant, well-oiled reaction of a finely tuned mechanism. Several warriors, without a sound, dissolved into the thicket to relieve invisible sentries and reinforce the perimeter, now bristling not only with spears, but with heightened senses. Others, equally silent, with maximum economy of motion, began setting up camp. From bundles came dense, waterproof cloak tents, and over cleared patches of ground. Melted water soon hissed in traveling copper pots hung on sturdy tripods. One of the trackers, with more refined, distinctly elven features, but the same flint-hard gaze, approached Finn. He said no word, offered no comfort, merely gestured with a soft but unyielding, authoritative motion that he wished to examine the stump, that mute seal of horror. A grim, watching this sudden and decisive change, this flash of order in the chaos of their existence, felt the monstrous, crushing weight that had lain on his shoulders all those endless days finally shift, allowing him to take the first truly deep breath, down to the very bottom of his lungs, unpoisoned by the fear of pursuit. This was not yet salvation, not the end of the journey, but it was a chance, a thin ray of light in utter darkness. The first firm, confident hand extended to them from the abyss of despair. Their solitude, their bitter, all-consuming loneliness, had finally ended. Now their flight, that blind, desperate movement away from death, was turning into a purposeful path, and their desperate, scathing word into a shared weapon to be hurled into the very heart of an indifferent world. Daryl nodded to his comrade, who gestured, in a manner understandable only to them, to summon to more. Together, moving with astonishing synchronicity, they carefully but confidently laid Finn out on a dark cloak spread on the ground. The youth instinctively shut his eyes, his body tensing in anticipation of new, unfamiliar pain. But the tracker's hands were incredibly firm, precise, and knowing. They caused no unnecessary suffering. Their touches were quick and professional. One, with a face that spoke of ancient elven blood, produced from his travel bag a small clay jar with a fix of smelling of bitter herbs and resin, and began to apply it carefully, almost tenderly, to the inflamed, reddened skin around the stump. The other, not wasting a second, prepared fresh, soft strips of clean, white cloth. A grim, unable to bear the sight of the bow's silent torment, turned away, and his gaze fell upon another tracker, with hair the color of tarnished silver, already bending over Al-Marion. The wounded centaur snorted, emerging from the cloud of his pain, that allowed the stranger to lift the blood and pus-soaked cloth from his mighty flank. The tracker, frowning with the concentrated look of a healer, examined the deed, gaping wound, then said something short and clipped to Daryl in their common, guttural tongue. Pus, Daryl translated bluntly, with a soldier's disgust for rot, addressing Vrondar. The wound's foul infection has taken root. Our poultice will draw it out, but it will take several days, no less, for the inflammation to subside, and flesh to begin knitting. Faster cannot be done, or the blood will poison completely. Vrondar, standing motionless as an idol, merely nodded his heavy head with grim resignation. Several more days, an eternity, when behind them villages might still be smoldering, and ahead lay the capital, which seemed unreachable in a lifetime. But there was no other way, as his old, experienced mind understood. Death from an arrow or sword was preferable to the slow agony of poisoned blood. Meanwhile, water boiled over the kindled fires, filling the air with a clean, hopeful sound. The trackers produced supplies from their bundles, strips of jerky hard as stone, strange-looking roots, and dense, nourishing flatbreads of coarse grain. Soon, mingling with the scent of pine needles and smoke, the rich, incredibly hearty and life-giving smell of real hot stew drifted through the camp. Thorian, Alina, and Guard, while the food cooked, had their wounds quickly and skillfully redressed, their cuts and bruises smeared with the same healing, bitter-smelling salve that brought first a chilling, then a warming relief. When wooden, worn bowls of steaming, fragrant stew were passed round the camp, an almost awkward, sepulchral silence fell, broken only by chewing and stifled sighs. The fugitives ate in silence, heads bowed, ravenously, unable to believe in this sudden, almost magical turn in their fate. This was not just food, staving off hunger. It was the first, true sign of a return from the realm of shadows to life, to hope. Fragile as spring ice but no less cherished for it. As they ate, swallowing the hot morsels, Daryl sat by the central fire, on a distant log, methodically and with practiced precision cleaning a piece of dried meat with his long, narrow knife. His glowing, night predator eyes studied them intently, unwaveringly, seeking not only weaknesses, but also grains of strength. "Tell us of the Iron Shaman," he said at last, setting aside the blade, and his voice, though quiet, held such intensity, even a grim start. "Everything you saw, heard, suspected, any detail, any scrap of rumor. What seems insignificant to you may be the key for us. A grim, fortified by the hot stew that spread a vital warmth through his veins, felt not just physical strength but clarity of thought returning, the ability to arrange events into a coherent, monstrous picture. He began to speak, and this time his account was more thorough, lacking the previous abruptness. He remembered the strange, inexplicable behavior of the Vargs, not just bestial fury, but a blind, almost ritual obedience that sent them charging to certain death. He recalled how the Orcs, contrary to their nature, did not loot alleyways but purposefully, with methodical cruelty, took prisoners, as if collecting a living tribute. They weren't just killing, Gart added hoarsely, shaking his head as if to dispel a vision. His eyes reliving the shadows of Prosecca. Our old healer, before he died, was muttering something about a crimson, unnatural glow over the very peaks of the Black Hills. Said that shaman seeks not slaves or gold, but souls, sucks them dry, like a spider. At these words, Daryl nodded slowly, with a soul-chilling solemnity, and his sharp, angular cheekbones tensed under his dark skin. Whispers of soul gathering, a voice left where villages stood, reached us too, he said curtly, each sound polished as a river stone. Through the whispers of refugees and death rattles, but the purpose that remains a mystery, shrouded in iron gloom. Souls are not stored in granaries, like grain, nor smelted into ingots. He fell silent, and in the depths of his glowing eyes flashed something more than understanding, a cold, ruthless insight. This changes the very nature of the threat. This is no longer just a war for land or power. It is something else, far more ancient and vile. He glanced over his warriors, frozen in expectation, and between them passed that silent, rapid dialogue of glances, understandable only to those who had long looked death in the face shoulder to shoulder. Your word to Al-Marion is now tenfold more important. Daryl turned back to the fugitives, and his voice acquired a new, steely firmness. But going there with only a tale, however sincere, is like spitting into a hurricane wind. They, sitting in their gilded chairs, need an object, tangible proof, something their pampered fingers can touch, something that cannot be dismissed as fancy. He paused, allowing these words to penetrate their consciousness, and in that pause lay all the weight of a ready, inevitable decision. Our path and yours now lead the same way. We become your escort, your shield and your sword, right up to the capital walls, and there we shall see what fate has in store for us. Silence fell in the camp, as deep as in the heart of the forest itself. They had come here, to this thicket, only for a brief respite, a mouthful of life-giving moisture, and they had been offered not just protection, but a military alliance, the burden and honor of which were immeasurable. And for the first time in many days and nights of endless flight, something stirred in a Grimm's chest, beneath the layers of weariness and grief, cold, heavy, and hard. Not hope yet, too fragile for their world, but a fierce, doubt-free resolve. The days in this temporary camp passed in their own rhythm, measure and purposeful, like the flow of a deep underground river. This was not rest in the usual, peaceful sense, rather a forced, violent pause, every moment filled with tense work and anxious, heart-wrenching anticipation. From dawn until sunset, when the last sunbeams died in the net of branches, the camp lived like a well-oiled war machine. Half the trackers would vanish soundlessly into the forest to patrol the surroundings, read traces on the damp earth, and hunt. They returned with game, a couple of lean, muscular boars, a handful of mottled forest birds, and then thick, smoky stews simmered in pots hung over the coals, giving strength to the weakened, shriveled bodies of the fugitives. The healing was slow, agonizingly slow for those whose souls were straining towards the road, driven by the ghosts of the fallen. Lorien, despite the strong, smoke and wormwood-smelling poultices of the trackers, still breathed heavily, with a whistle, and rose to his mighty legs with visible effort. The wound on his flank, terrible and deep, slowly, day by day, closed with a pink film of new skin, but the knots working on his jaw and the deep wrinkles around his eyes spoke eloquently of the hellish pain he concealed behind a mask. Finn resembled a pale, translucent shadow, cut from moonlight. The sharp, cutting pain had subsided, replaced by a dull, aching numbness and weakness, but the feverish, unhealthy gleam in his deeply sunken eyes did not fade. He lay motionless for days, staring at the green canopy of trees, only occasionally forcing himself to overcome his own apathy, trying with his one remaining hand to help as best he could, handing water to a wounded comrade, adjusting wood on the dying fire. A Grimm, whose own wounds were shallow and had begun to heal, help the trackers as he could, finding solace in simple physical labor, splitting firewood with ringing, precise blows, mending torn tack, sharpening weapons on a small whetstone whose monotonous screech merged with the stream's nose. His hammer, carefully cleaned of dry black blood, lay in a visible spot, leaning against a tree like a mute reproach to the past and a grim promise for the future. Vrondar and Darrell often secluded themselves apart, their quiet, measured conversations by a distant, weak fire lasting for hours. They exchanged worn maps drawn in thin lines on pieces of durable tan hide, discussing every twist of the future route, and all possible threats awaiting them on the way to Al-Marion. Thorian, whose body gradually grew stronger thanks to hearty food and rest, became Melina's constant shadow. He learned from her how to set cunning snares for small game, how to find edible, Swedish roots under the layer of needles, how to read the complex script of tracks on damp earth. The silent, reserved archer, despite her innate reticence, patiently answered his timid questions in monosyllables. Between them, like a sprout through stone, arose a strange, unspoken bond, not friendship, not love, but a silent, mutual respect between two wounded warriors forced to rely on each other in this cruel world. And then came the morning, when Vrondar, leaning on his spear staff, for the first time slowly, but independently walked the length of the entire camp, his face showing no visible pain. Lorien, with difficulty, could stand without support, his legs, once mighty, regaining stability. Even Finn, for the first time in all those long days, approached the stream on his own, without assistance, to wash his gaunt, sweat-beaded face. Strength, drop by drop, was returning to their emaciated bodies, inexorably as the tide. That evening, as the sun drowned in a crimson haze behind the treetops, Darrell, standing in the center of the camp, announced simply and clearly, "At first light tomorrow, we move out." His words, heavy and precise, hung in the cool evening air, filled with the scent of pine, smoke, and damp earth. Each day of delay, each postponement, plays into the enemy's hand, adds to his strength. But now we go not as wretched fugitives, glancing into every shadow. We go as witnesses, bearing truth on our shoulders. And if fate is kind, as bearers of irrefutable proof. The camp froze, absorbing these words. The few days of hard-won respite were over. Ahead lay the endless road again, constant danger, and their only compass like goal to hammer on the deaf, indifferent walls of Al-Marion. But now behind them stood these silent, deadly shadows of trackers, and in their very chests, beneath their ribs, there glimmered and pulsed not only blind fury, but a cold, hard one, flint-like resolve. The next days of travel became an exhausting, merciless test of endurance and spirit. Darrell laid them not along dusty, well-trodden roads or enemy ambushes or imperial patrols might lurk, but along remote, barely visible animal trails, along the bottoms of deep ravines overgrown with thorny brush, and across the dry, stony beds of long-forgotten rivers. They moved like true shadows soundlessly, merging with the landscape, avoiding open, sun-drenched spaces, crossing rare clearings and meadows only under the cover of deep, impenetrable night, when the air itself seemed blind and deaf. Each step, each climb up another hill came with difficulty, echoing in their weary bodies as a dull, insistent pain. Lorien, though strengthened by the days of rest, breathed heavily, with a whistle, on steep ascents, and sweat drops like resin rolled down his powerful neck. Finn paled and swayed in his saddle, his one hand convulsively, knuckles whitening, gripping the thick mane as if it were the last anchor in a stormy sea of fear and weakness. Even the hardiest among them, even the trackers, felt old, not fully healed wounds aching and throbbing in the penetrating, damp night air, saturated with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. But to delay, to stop, was impossible. Each lost minute ceded initiative to the enemy, and this knowledge burned inside them hotter than any fire. Their path, winding and invisible, lay through lands that did not yet know the true calamity, had not seen the crimson glow in the east, but already breathed with a vague, unformed anxiety. Like cattle before a storm, the trackers, knowing every path, led them along the edges, past slumbering settlements. But even from the thicket, through the dense net of branches, unusual, alarming activity could be seen. In one village, drowning in pre-dawn mist, men with pitchforks and dull axes hastily reinforced a sagging fence, their voices, abrupt and angry, reaching the travelers as a muffled hum. In another, sentinels on a wooden bell tower like a dried-up finger peered intently, unwaveringly, eastwards, from where the wind blew. The air here, not yet poisoned by smoke, was filled with unspoken, sticky fear rumors. Those winged and ugly children of war had already done their black work, poisoning peace. Word from the borders, even distorted, travels faster than we do, Daryl stated grimly, without emotion, observing the unfamiliar, defenseless village from the impenetrable thicket, his slit eyes sliding over silhouettes. But rumors are mere whispers, breeding panic can blind terror. And panic, Vrondar, he said, turning to the old centaur, is a poor counselor for rulers, makes them bar gates, not sharpen swords. A grim, standing nearby, nodded silently, his heavy heart making the motion. His fingers, with a familiar, almost mechanical motion, gripped the haft of his hammer. Feeling the rough wood under his callous skin, he saw the difference, the chasm separating them from these people. Those were preparing for defense, trembling from the unknown, from the specter of a threat. Their small, battered party carried within them not a whisper, but a loud, scathing truth, backed by scars, dense in armor, and the smell of ash ingrained in their clothes. A truth that should force the Empire's decaying power not merely to defend, but to act, to strike first, before it was too late. They went on, bearing this burden, searching along the way for any, even the smallest proof, that the land here, west of Prosecca, held only traces of ordinary, peaceful life. Deep wagon ruts, hoof prints, discarded, moldy field rations of Imperial soldiers from the last patrol, nothing that screamed of war, of an approaching end. And in this deceptive, deadly ordinariness lay a special, insidious danger. How to convince anyone, especially those unwilling to listen, of a threat's reality? And all around was quiet, calm, and the sun still rose as always. They are gathering strength somewhere deep in the Black Hills, Daryl said quietly one evening. More to himself, his motionless figure turned eastward where the sky already merged with darkness. And their patience, their endurance, frightens me more than any blind fury. When they finally decide to move, their blow will be crushing, like a battering ram against rotten gates. The thought of what they might already have done to Elodie and other captives there, in the very heart of the burgeoning darkness, made a grin clench his fists, until the pain was sweeter than any inaction. But he restrained himself, swallowing the lump of fury rising in his throat. His revenge, the blacksmith's revenge, must be not blind, but cold, calculated, strategic. To convince Al-Marion was to snatch from the iron shaman his main, carefully guarded trump card, the element of surprise, the blinding strike from the shadows. With each day, with each new, furtively covered mile, not just physical weariness, but a solid, granite cold resolve mature and hardened within them. They were a living, breathing warning, a bloody arrow piercing through the thickness of indifference and willful ignorance. And for this goal, they were ready to crawl on all fours, to endure pain and deprivation. If only their voice, hoarse and broken, would finally be heard behind the high, deaf walls of the capital, before it became irrevocably, finally, too late for her as well. During one of the forced halts, while the others, seizing the moment, tried to snatch a little precious, heavy sleep, Daryl and Vrondar settled by a dying, almost heatless fire. A thin stream of smoke rose into the cold pre-dawn air, mingling with their quiet, measured voices, sounding like echoes of another, bygone era. Your kin, Vrondar, always preferred the open, windy steps to these stone cages of the capital, Daryl remarked, tossing a dry, brittle twig into the smoldering embers. It crackled and flared, then died. And we left Al-Marion when the last of the pure-blooded elves abandoned their white quarters. They simply dissolved into the shadowy forest pots, as if they had never been. And the city since then is not the same. It is orphaned. Vrondar nodded silently, heavily, his wise, much-seen eyes fixed on the scarlet embers in which glimmers of distant fires seemed to dance. We heard a sickness of a great organism, lasting more than a decade. Sickness? No. Death. Daryl corrected him, and in his low voice sounded an old, scar-over bitterness. The great roads. Remember them, old friend? Arrows piercing the entire continent, stones fitted by dwarves so tightly a razor's edge couldn't slip between. Along them flowed not only goods, like a river through them pulsed, coursed the very life of the Empire, its blood and its spirit. Now they are like severed arteries, overgrown with weeds and silence. Bridges collapsed into chasms. The Empire slowly bled out, turning into a handful of isolated, weakening lands. He fell silent, letting these bitter words hang in the ringing silence of the sleeping forest. And the universities, deep underground, in halls that could rival the dwarves' own vaults, all the knowledge of the world was stored. elven scrolls covered in glyphs, dwarven treatises on allies and wars, human chronicles spanning millennia, eternal lamps, fed by magic itself, illuminated the path to truth, accessible to all three peoples. Now, Daryl gave a bitter, soundless snort, tossing a dark lock from his forehead. Darkness and sepulchral silence. Tattered pages carried away by drafts wandering cold, empty corridors. The Empire's brain has rotted, Vrondar, and with it, irrevocably, rotted the wisdom of old. The Hall of Three Crowns, Vrondar whispered, more to himself than to his companion, as if summoning a long-forgotten image. Yes, 3 thrones, of ancient wood, living stone, and white marble, under vaults where the ancient elves had traced shimmering maps of the celestial bodies. I stood there as a bow, saw them rule not as masters, but as guardians. Equals. Daryl's voice grew hard as steel. Now spiders, dust, and oblivion rule there, and on the marble throne, the throne of men, sits a pale shadow of what was Empress Aliana, last of her line. She rules phantoms, Vrondar. Her court is whisperers, flatterers, and schemers, and her decrees are not heard beyond the city walls. The Empire's heart has stopped and turned black. And the forges? Vrondar asked, and in his voice sounded a last, faint note of something like hope. The dwarven hearths in the yonder mountain workshops, do they at least work? Daryl gave a bitter, soundless smile, and in his glowing eyes was not a spark of mirth. Work? Men try, picking up what was dropped, but without the hands of dwarf masters it's a pitiful, wretched semblance. Clangor, soot, constant flaws, the most complex mechanisms that once sang under elven enchantments now creak, break, and fall silent. They rivet iron that shatters at the first serious blow. They have hands, but the soul of the craft, its innermost essence, is lost forever. The Empire has forgotten not only how to think, old friend, but also how to create. It merely mimics life, like a puppet on strings. He looked east, from where the wind blew, carrying the bitterish aftertaste of ash and distant, implacable calamity. His gaze seemed to pierce time and space, reaching towards the place where the far bank once stood, where the earth was soaked with the blood of his people. And now we go back to this disgraced, decrepit, dying before our eyes city, not for aid, for no aid is to be expected in this world that has forgotten duty. We go to awaken a slumbering, senile giant, before it is finished off, torn apart by vultures. We bring it not a plea, but a diagnosis, harsh and dispassionate as a field surgeon's knife. And if it does not hear, Daryl did not finish, leaving the terrible words hanging in the air, but his glowing, night predator eyes with icy clarity completed the thought. If Al-Marion did not hear, did not shake off its stupor, then very soon its majestic walls and towers would be swallowed by the same dust, sepulchral silence, and all-consuming oblivion that had already swallowed the Hall of Three Crowns and the great roads. The following days and nights of travel merged into one continuous, soul-crushing stripe of weariness, where time flowed like thick resin. They walked until their legs buckled and burned with fire, slept in snatches, wrapped in coarse cloaks on the cold, unwelcoming ground, and rose again to trudge on. Rare, wine-scoured forests gave way to hilly, ravine-cut terrain, which in turn yielded to vast, sun-scorched plains and trampled pastures, only to be replaced again by new ridges of hills like petrified giants. The air grew drier, carrying a barely perceptible, the clinging dust kicked up by hooves and worn soles, and the persistent, constant smell of smoke not acrid from burning houses, but domestic, hearth smoke, from thousands of hearths burning somewhere beyond the horizon. We approach the central lands, Daryl said one morning, peering into the milky, dirty haze veiling the horizon. The capital is still days away, but here you can already feel the heavy, musty breath of the Empire, or what's left of it, he added, his slit eyes scanning the pall. The scent of fear, decline, and decay. They now more often saw joyless, dreary signs of life, cultivated but sparsely sown fields, windmills on hilltops whose peeling, lazy blades barely turned, rare, squat, mushroom-like villages shrouded in morning mist. But even here, in the very heart of what was once a great and mighty state, ran the same familiar desolation they knew from the marches. Roads, which they now sometimes crossed with the utmost caution, were broken by countless wheels and washed out by rains, overgrown at the edges with thorny weeds and burdock. Travelers they encountered weary, destitute merchants, itinerant craftsmen with eyes like banked coals looked upon their strange, motley party with mute, animal wariness, and upon seeing the powerful, scar-etched figures of the Centaurs, they would hurriedly veer aside, quickening their pace and bowing their heads low. They fear new, unfamiliar faces like the plague. A grin growled through clenched teeth, watching a wagon rattle desperately into a dusty, weed-choked ditch to avoid them, as if the plague were still at the gates, not already battering those very doors with a heavy ram. For them, for these people, it is still at the gates, Darrell answered in a detached, weary tone. Here, in the shadow of walls, they still believe in old fairy tales. Believe Al-Marion's walls are impregnable. They do not understand, do not wish to understand, that stone walls, however high, are worthless if behind them emptiness in souls and rot in the very foundation. Strength, drop by drop, returned to the weakest of the wounded. Al-Marion could now bear a small load on his still painful, powerful shoulders. Bundles, provisions, heavy waterskins and Finn, though remaining silent as a tomb, began to move a little, unsteadily. Without constant, humiliating assistance. One evening by a campfire, he even tried, clumsily and with concentration, to help Thorian peel potatoes for the evening stew with his one remaining hand, with a look as if performing the greatest task in the world. Grim saw this from under his furrowed brows and nodded silently, almost imperceptibly, in approval. It was a small, insignificant victory on the world scale, but so important for them all, a victory over despair and muteness. Once, skirting the edge of an abandoned, weed-choked field, they came upon a forsaken hut, not raided by orcs, not burned, but simply abandoned in haste, yet with a strange, doomed thoroughness. In the house, smelling of dust and mice, stood untouched, crude furniture, cold, compacted ash lay in the hearth, and even a forgotten clay mug sat on the table. Fled, one of the trackers stated dispassionately, inspecting the empty, overgrown yard. A week ago, two at most, took what they could and left. Abandoned land, hearth, memory. Where to? Guard asked hoarsely, with a sudden, aching longing in his woes, looking at the empty, lifeless house. To the capital, likely. Darrell shrugged, and in his gesture was bitter, weary irony. Seeking protection behind stone walls, unaware they bring with them in their carts not only pitiful chow, but the seeds of the very panic that will doom them faster than any enemy sword. And in that moment, looking at this mute, piercing picture of flight, a grim fully, chest-crushingly, grasped the true, monstrous scale of their mission. They bore not just word of raids on distant marches. They carried with them the bitter, wormwood truth of a sickness that slowly but surely was devouring the empire from within. A sickness of fear, universal indifference, and unstoppable, total decay. The orcs and their iron shaman were merely a symptom, a festering, burst abscess on a body weakened and exhausted by long illness. The grueling week since meeting the trackers lay behind them, like a long, tortuous dream. They ascended the crest of a gentle, wine-scoured hill emaciated, covered in a thick layer of road dust and dry, scab-like grime, with faces in which pain and unyielding resolve were frozen. Their spirit was not broken, it had merely hardened, turning into something cold, sharp, and unbending, like a blade tempered at the very bottom of despair. And then, halting, they saw it, the sight for which they had passed through the fire of conflagrations, through rivers of others and their own blood, through unbearable losses that left only silent, empty chasms in their souls. Before them, in a milky haze of distance, lay Al-Marion. Rivers, blocked by half-ruined, forgotten dams, slowly, lazily encircled the imperial capital, but it did not shine in their murky, unclean reflection, as in old, long-mouldered tales. It was a vast, gray, stone colossus, oppressive in its soulless, cold grandeur. Endless crenellated walls, countless towers, shapeless masses of roofs rising in tiers towards the very center, where the complex, lace-like and therefore even more alien, impregnable silhouette of the Palace of Three-Crowned Sword. From the city, from its stone, voiceless mass, emanated not living power, but the cold, indifferent majesty of a mausoleum, a giant sepulchre. It seemed not to live, not to breathe, but simply to stand, frozen in time, sunk in its long dead and mouldered dreams. All stood motionless, gazing at the goal of their long, agonizing, and bloody journey. No one spoke a word. The silence was more eloquent than any shouts. Well then, Grim was the first to break the oppressive, viscous silence, and his voice, accustomed to roaring and command, sounded with a new, steely, doubt-free firmness. We have come. Now we must make them hear us, so that within these deaf, stone walls, ears may finally be found capable of hearing truth. Daryl, standing beside him, motionless as a statue, gave a dark, soundless smirk, and his glowing, cat-like eyes narrowed to two thin slits. That, blacksmith, may prove harder than passing through a whole horde of hungry varks. Prepare your proofs. He nodded briefly towards Ogrim's inseparable hammer. And your fury, hard-won and tempered in fire. Both will be needed, I assure you. Yet, between standing on the hill gazing at the stone monstrosity and finally setting foot on the war-cobbled pavement of its outskirts, lay an eternity of heavy, humiliating, oppressive waiting. The great bridge that should have served as the capital's triumphal gate was choked to capacity, turned into a giant, immobile clod of human misery and despair. Wagons laden with pitiful, beggarly chattel were locked in an endless, dismal queue stretching a good mile. People, animals, acrid dust, and deafening, senseless clamor merged into a single, seething, subdued mush, over which hung a sour, nauseating smell of unwashed sweat, fresh dung, and thick, almost tangible human fear. Legionnaires of the city guard, in tarnished, ill-fitting armor bearing the crest of the faded empire, a stylized but meaningless, lifeless crown, conversed lazily, without a trace of interest, by the massive oak gates, occasionally and without zeal, almost with boredom, letting through a wagon or two. Their faces, sunburned and wine-chapped, expressed not the vigilance of guardians of order, but a profound, bone-deep apathy and weariness from a meaningless existence. They were not defenders at a frontier, but rather jailers guarding the gates to a perishing, slowly decomposing world, and seen perfectly, to the last drop, aware of it. Nothing has changed, Daryl said quietly, with a bitter, soundless smile, observing this dismal, heart-wrenching scene. They still check travel papers of those who beg their protection, and do not wish to see, that death itself is no longer at the gates, but is diffused in this air, in this dust, in their very indifference. Their appearance, their strange, motley, and battered look, caused immediate, nervous commotion. People crammed in the crowd glanced along, warily, at the majestic figures of the Centaurs, their frightened, darting eyes sliding over the stern, impassive faces of the trackers, lingering on the crusted, bloody bandages and the empty, chest-press sleeve of Finn's tunic. A whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm, ran through the throng, swelling into a hum. From the marches, look, wounded, fugitives, wretches. Ogrim felt the familiar, acrid, coppery taste of fury rising in his throat, constricting it. They had passed through the very fires of hell, bore on their wounded shoulders the truth of a whole world's fall, and here, at the very goal, they were met not with alarm, not readiness for action, but this suffocating, petty bureaucracy and the animal, blind fear of commoners afraid of everything alien, everything bearing the stamp of endured calamity. Approaching the very gates, they were stopped by the captain of the watch, a portly, bloated man with a puffy, sleep-deprived face frozen in a mask of perpetual irritation. Halt. Passage closed until evening. On what business? His voice was hoarse from constant shouting and ingrained dust. We are from the eastern marches. Ogrim stepped forward, and his bass, accustomed to overriding the din of a forge, sounded loud and commanding, making a couple of the nearest guardsmen flinch involuntarily. We bear word for the Council of Lords. Word of war. Of true war. The captain of the watch slowly, with obvious, unconcealed distrust, surveyed their travel-worn, dust-covered, sweat and smoke-scented party. His gaze, heavy and dull, lingered on Ogrim's mighty hammer, on Finn's pale-as-linen, gaunt face. Word, he repeated, and in his puffy eyes sparked neither understanding nor alarm, only the customary, bureaucratic irritation. Every second one here has word, whose crop burned, whose livestock died. Everyone's in trouble. Everyone's at war. Everyone has pleas for the Empress. Wait in line, like everyone else. Khajiits yesterday, Centaurs today, and tomorrow who knows, he added a moment later, but now under his breath, with a tinge of revulsion. At that moment, something in Ogrim, long accumulated and restrained, snapped with a quiet, dry crack. The patience hoarded over weeks, born amidst unbearable pain, hunger, and perpetual fear, burst like an over-dry, ready-to-snap bowstring. He took a step forward, and his shadow, huge and heavy, engulfed the guard from head to toe. The air around suddenly grew thick and heavy, as before a thunderclap. Our village was burned to the ground, Ogrim spoke, and each sound was honed and cold as an axe blade. our people slaughtered or taken captive. We came here to prevent the same from happening to you. We bring not a plea, we bring warning, and we will pass. Now, he did not shout, did not raise his voice, but in his quietness, in his immobile posture, was such power, such an unshakable, hard-won certainty in his rightness, that several guardsmen involuntarily stepped back, and the captain paled and momentarily lost his bureaucratic hauteur. He saw before him not a beggarly, destitute supplicant, but an envoy of death itself, a harbinger of apocalypse, and this sight broke him. All right, he muttered, hastily averting his gaze. Pass through. But you answer for yourselves. And the Centaurs, they're not allowed in the city. By the rules. Not permitted. Rules, Vrondar said with a bitter, joyless smile, halting right at the gate's arch, on the very border of two worlds. His mighty, Skaran bandaged figure seemed the embodiment of the wild, free steppe, forever separated from this stone, stifling anthill. We will wait here, by the gates. Tell them the steppe will stand with the Empire, if only it makes the right and swift decision. But, somehow, I doubt it. He swept his gaze once more, slowly and appraisingly, over Al-Marion's high, indifferent walls, and in his eyes was not hope, but only weary bitterness. With these words, the old centaur turned, shielding his kin with his powerful flanks from the curious and frightened stares of the crowd. A grim Daryl with a couple of his trackers, Finn, Thorian, Elric, and guard those who were now to become the voice of the ruin marches finally, with heavy hearts. Crossed the threshold, they were met not by a shining, radiant city from legends, but by a wide, dusty, dreary avenue, lined on both sides with adobe and time-blackened stone houses. The air here was even thicker, saturated with dense smells of cheap food, human waste, coal smoke, and hundreds of thousands of lives squeezed into unimaginable closeness. The city did not sleep its seat. Faust scurried like a disturbed anthill. Cries of vendors, children's wails, the screech of countless carts all merged into a deafening, continuous, oppressive roar in which individual words, thoughts, and hope itself were drowned. Finn, seeing for the first time in his life not endless forests and steppes, but this stone, roaring belly, instinctively pressed against a grim, his one hand convulsively, knuckles whitening, clutching a fold of the blacksmith's coarse cloak. His eyes, accustomed to expanses and silence, squinted painfully, unable to encompass and comprehend this monstrous accumulation of walls, people, and deafening noise. A grim, looking at this feverish, senseless bustle, felt not horror, but cold, undivided, all-consuming fury. They stood in the very heart of the Empire, but this heart did not beat, it trembled feebly and helplessly in the fever of momentary cares and base fears. They walked along the once majestic, now forgotten avenue, and Daryl, as if reading a funeral service for a dead friend, softly, with pointing gestures, marked the traces of decay. His voice was even, almost monotone, but in every uttered word, in every gesture, was an old, incurable pain. See these cracks, these black seams in the pavement? He nodded towards gaping hollows between granite slabs where sickly, gray wormwood grew, as if the earth itself tried to heal wounds inflicted by men. Dwarves laid them for centuries, swore these stones would outlast even the fall of great mountains. They did not outlast our indifference and sloth. A grim walked silently, heavily treading, looking at his feet. Under his rough, dust-covered boots, with each step crunched fragments of shattered, once multi-hued mosaics that had depicted intertwined tree roots, an ancient and sacred symbol of the Great Alliance. Now from the grand design remain only fading colored spots in street filth, trampled into dust by thousands of feet. And over there, Daryl pointed a thin, confident gesture at a massive, time-blackened building with a collapsed corner like a felled giant, was the great library of Al-Marion. Its silent halls descended 7 levels deep into cool underground. Elves kept their scrolls with songs of the first star's birth, dwarves blueprints of wondrous machines that pumped living water from the deepest earth veins. Now it's a warehouse for rotten potatoes and mouse droppings. They turned into a narrow, dark alley squeezed between high walls, and Thorian involuntarily gasped, struck by the sight. There soared an elegant, era-like elven tower, its walls covered with intricate, frozen music-like tracery, that at its base, like a festering sore, clung a crude, crooked wooden structure 3 stories high, from whose windows came a deafening, senseless clangor of hammers. The air here was thick, acrid, and bitter to the taste. The smithing quarter, Daryl explained without emotion, his thin nose wrinkling from the pungent mix of coal smoke and cooling slag fumes. Dwarven masters worked here once. Their forges did not clang, they sang. And the steel from under their hammers was stronger than purest diamond. Now, he waved a hand in disgust towards the smoking, sky-soiling chimneys. They burn low-grade coal, spoil good or cast flawed goods that fall apart in the first real fight. But production, you see, is growing. They think quantity can replace quality, forgetting that against the darkness, numbers avail not. Finn, walking beside him, suddenly halted, his already pale face contorted in a grimace of almost physical pain. He looked at a huge, unnaturally empty lot, surrounded by broken, bone-like fragments of white marble. The place looked naked and scorched, as if the city's very heart had been violently torn out. Even the earth here seemed dead, gray, and barren. This is where Thorian began, guessing with horror. The White Grove, Daryl said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the shadows. His glowing eyes narrowed as if from an acute, long-held pain, cut down by Empress Aeliana's personal decree, to clear space for a new, gilded monument to her own fading dynasty. Trees planted by the hands of this city's founders. They remembered the voices and laughter of the first settlers. Their roots drank the same water as the builders of these very walls. He looked directly at a grim, and in his gaze was bottomless, mountain lake deep bitterness. To tear that out by the roots is to destroy memory itself, to kill the past. And it turned out to be the simplest thing in the world. Grim was silent, fists clenched. He looked at this dead lot, and he saw not it, but the smoldering ash of the far bank. The same ruthless emptiness, the same trampling of memory and foundations. Only there they burned houses and people, and here the soul, the very soul of the city. They emerged onto a vast, dimly lit square. In its center, on a high pedestal, stood a blackened, crack-webbed monolith of a strange, blue-tinged metal. "The Great Codex," said Daryl, not approaching closer, looking at the grim obelisk with cold detachment, forged in a single furnace as an eternal reminder to posterity. From the metal of vanquished arachnids, it was believed impervious to time or the fiercest blows. He gave a bitter, soundless smirk. Turns out, it fears dull axes hacking at living memory. It cracked with a sound like a groan the very moment the first blade bit into the oldest tree of the White Grove. Since then, the fissure only widens, consuming the metal itself. The yawning fissure, black as a rift in reality, indeed split the monolith from its very peak to the granite base, and it seemed with each day, with each breath of the city, it grew slightly wider, mercilessly swallowing the rare glimmers of dull sun on its once mirror-polished surface. And finally, at the square's end, before them like a mountain, rose the Palace of Three Crowns. Its walls still held faint traces of former grandeur and craftsmanship, but many windows were dark and blind. At the main, colossal entrance, under the shadow of time-tarnished, patina-covered gates, crowded a dense guard of sentinels in worn, carelessly fitted armor. There were about 20 of them, and they looked upon the crowd of wretched supplicants speeding at the threshold with open, unconcealed hostility and deadly boredom, crossing their halberds and letting not a single soul pass. Well then, Daryl exhaled quietly, strangled. The Empire's heart, or rather, what's left of it, a gilded crypt. A grin gripped the haft of his hammer until his knuckles cracked, feeling under his fingers the familiar, vital unevenness and the reliable cold of solid, unyielding metal. He looked at Finn's snow-pale face, at Thorian's bandage, still throbbing arm, at the stern, battle-hardened faces of his few tracker companions. Then the blacksmith measured with a long, heavy gaze the line of guardsmen, their bored but absolutely unyielding faces, and the pitiful, exhausted crowd of supplicants vainly trying to hammer on stone hearts of power. "They will not let us through," he said dully, with ultimate clarity, and in his voice was no trace of surprise, no flash of anger, only a heavy, hammer-like certainty in this verdict. They do not see the people behind the faces, they see only bothersome beggars and dirty paupers. A grim's foreboding proved prophetic with that frightening, humiliating to all living things accuracy that makes even stones shudder when their small but sharply distinct from the crowd group approached the palace. The line of guards instantly transformed. From a relaxed, board wall they turned into a palisade unshakable and sharp, forged of polished steel and icy human indifference. From their ranks stepped forward a man, his face, immobile and hard, seemed carved from the same gray granite as these very walls. Tarnished armor with worn edges at the joints sat on him like a second skin, habitual and careless. His gaze, cold and assessing, without a trace of curiosity, slid over the hardened faces of the trackers, lingered on a Grimm's gigantic, fearsome hammer, and finally sank into the pale, lifeless features of the crippled Finn. In that gaze was not alarm, but only dull irritation, like that of a man torn from simple, routine work. Halt! His voice hacked the air, sharp and peremptory, like the blow of an axe butt on stone. Passage to the palace is forbidden to all without a personal summons bearing the council's seal. A Grimm took a step forward. His shadow, broad and heavy, covered the guardsman head to foot, but the man did not even flinch. Our summons is the ash of our homes and the blood of our children, came the low, subterranean rumble of the blacksmith. Each word was honed by pain and fury. We are from the eastern march. To Far Bank, Stone Fort, and Proseca are scorched clean by hordes. The Iron Shaman's legions march to war. We need to speak to the council, to the Empress, now. In the palace guard's eyes, faded from boredom and indifference, not a single muscle twitched. With the Empress? He repeated shortly, with a contemptuous snicker, exchanging a glance with a neighboring guardsman who stood with an equally stony face. You have no council summons with a seal. Get lost, beggars. Don't clutter the approaches to the palace. Our words are sealed not with ink, but with our own clotted blood. For the first time, Daryl's voice, always so restrained and cold, held a living, breaking fury. Like the snarl of a wounded beast, we brought here not tavern whispers of rumors. We brought testimony seared by fire into our flesh and our souls. To this, the guardsmen, closing ranks into a single, soulless formation, took a synchronized step forward like marionettes, steel, razor-sharp halberd blades lowered with a dry clatter, forming before them a deadly, impassable palisade of steel and human indifference. A Grimm slowly turned, his heavy, most gaze meeting Daryl's burning one. Not a single word was spoken between them, but it was understood without words. To force their way through this wall of flesh and metal, they could try, at the cost of their own and others' lives, but that would instantly turn them from messengers into outlaws, rebels whose words, however bitter and true, no one would ever listen to again. He had been right in his darkest forebodings. They were not let through, not because they were nobodies, rootless refugees, but because they bore within themselves too terrible, too inconvenient and destructive for peaceful sleep a truth. They had come, overcoming pain and despair, to the very heart of the empire, but that heart proved deaf, stony, and cold. And now they stood before this blind, soulless wall, with a truth paid for in rivers of blood and seas of tears, and which, it turned out, no one wished to hear. A Grimm did not lower his head, did not turn away his gaze. His gaze, accustomed to peering for hours at red-hot metal, discerning the tiniest, invisible to others cracks, now with the same stubbornness studied the palace's monumental walls, seeking in them at least some, even the tiniest, fissure. We'll wait, he said quietly, turning to Daryl, and in his voice was not submission, but strategic endurance. Any wall, even the strongest, has its crack, its weak spot. We'll observe, learn when the guard changes, where the servants go, and from where supplies are brought. Daryl nodded darkly, almost imperceptibly, his glowing, night predator eyes slowly, appraisingly sliding over the grim, indifferent walls, absorbing every detail. Wise. But to spend the night here, a square would instantly betray us and our intentions. There's an inn nearby, called the Old Watch. A refuge for those whom, like us, they didn't let pass these stones. We'll stay there. But first to our own. Vrondar must know what is happening. They moved back across the vast, oppressive square, and with each step the deafening, senseless roar of the great city grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking their silent defeat. At the main gates, in the shadow of the massive arch, awaited tense, anxious expectation. Vrondar, Lorien, and the other centaurs stood forming a living, mighty, and imposing ring, fencing off their space from curious and fearful gazes. What news, blacksmith? Vrondar's voice sounded outwardly calm, but in its very depths, as in the depths of a pool, lurked a steely, unbending readiness for any turn of events. What was expected, Grimm stated, not concealing the bitterness. The guard is deaf as a rock and blind as a mole, but we are not leaving. Not now. We'll find another way, another chink. 7 days, Vrondar said, not asking, but stating a fact. No more. The steppe has waited, and will not wait forever for stone hearts to beat anew. He fell silent, and his ancient, Wise gaze grew detached, turned inward. While you were there, behind the walls, I saw someone, an old Cogit, one of those who remember the dust of the great deserts, with a great eagle on his shoulder. A rare sight within these stone walls. All who heard him involuntarily grew alert. Cogits, those children of sands and wind, rarely left their distant sandy valleys, appearing here only with the most valuable trade caravans. He looked broken, Frondar continued, and his voice grew quieter, like the rustle of dry grass. Graying dreads and tatters, gaze extinguished, as if burned out by the sun's heat, managed to exchange a few words. His tribe, living in the wastes, fell before the onslaught of darkness. Remnants fled through deep, dark caves into the southeastern steppes, to the foothills of the misty peaks. The old centaur heaved a heavy, rasping sigh, his mighty chest rising. The darkness does not sleep, blacksmith. It is no longer at the borders, it is already knocking at the very thresholds. And if the empire does not awaken, does not rouse from its lethargic sleep, he did not finish, did not utter the terrible words aloud. But each of those standing around understood without further explanation. 7 days. This was not merely a term of vain waiting by the walls. It was a merciless countdown to that very moment when flight, a new, even more desperate one, would become the only reasonable and possible choice. The farewell was brief, stern, without extra words or sentimental gestures. Turning their backs on their comrades, Agrin and his few companions stepped once again, with heavy hearts, under the shadow of this dying but still haughty city, bearing on their bent shoulders the burden of a word that grew heavier and more unbearable with each hour. The old watch met them not with hearth warmth or friendly light, but with the thick, suffocating smell of cheap, burnt stew and a damp, sweetish taint of decay. The tavern nestled right at the base of an ancient, moss-grown fortress wall, like a poisonous parasite fungus on the trunk of an old, dying tree. Its walls, built of rough, irregular stone, had absorbed over long years all the dampness of centuries, and the acrid soot of an eternally smoking hearth. Through soot-blackened, time-darkened ceiling beams broke pale, sickly light in short, dusty columns, in which midges circled slowly and despondently. The air inside was thick, heavy, and stale, smelling of sour, spoiled beer, scorched fat, and the sweat of unwashed bodies. Underfoot with each step crunched horse and rotten straw, long lost the ability to absorb endless filth and spilled swill. In a corner, on a wretched, hastily knocked together stage of shifted wine barrels, sat a blind, shriveled old man quietly, monotonously plucking a broken, out-of-tune lute, playing the same dismal, nameless melody, as if mourning something irrevocably and forever lost. At tables cobbled from rough, unplaned boards and coated with a sticky, greasy film, sat those whom the great city had finally cast off, spat out, worn out, bankrupt merchants with empty, extinguished eyes, mercenaries in battered, rusting mail vainly seeking any employment, refugees whose faces bore the eternal, indelible stamp of hunger, fear, and irreparable loss. They ate in silence, not looking around, staring into their bowls as if afraid to meet their own distorted reflection. In tarnished pewter mugs, the proprietor, a fat, bald man with a face as indifferent as a scoop-hat pumpkin and a grime-smeared apron, silently brought them what was mockingly called supper here. Thin, murky broth, in whose dirty liquid floated a few yellowish, tasteless roots and dark, tough, stringy chunks of meat of indeterminate origin. With it came black, damp, sticky bread that smelled of musty, rancid flour, and rough clay mugs of a turbid, brown liquid only remotely resembling true ale in taste and smell. Finn, struggling with his one hand, pushed his bowl away with silent, deep disgust. Thorian ate silently, mechanically, almost without chewing, his gaze turned deep within himself, into his own nightmares. A grim, overcoming rising nausea, forced himself to swallow this poison, feeling each spoonful settle in his stomach as a cold, tasteless, dead lump. Even Darrell, usually imperturbable and indifferent to all, took one single sip from his mug with open, unconcealed revulsion and did not touch it again, as if contact with it defiled him. This tavern, this wretched fare, these extinguished people altogether was an exact, hammer-on-anvil reflection of the entire empire, long and hopelessly fallen into decay. Not a heroic death in the blinding fire of a great battle, not a fall under crushing blows of a mighty foe, but a slow, humiliating, day-by-day rotting from within, like a disease undermining a mighty oak, leaving only a rotten shell, the loss not only of former greatness and glory, but of simple, human dignity, taste for life itself, the very ability to distinguish fresh food from outright rot. Sitting in this stinking, dark parody of a refuge, they with soul-chilling clarity understood that the main battle for Al-Marion had perhaps long been lost without a single shot. Their struggle now was not for the revival of former glory, but to stop the final, irreversible transformation of all that was living and sound into such a pitiful, senseless parody of life itself. 6 long, soul-exhausting days and 6 endless, anxious nights they waged their silent, invisible war. Their headquarters was the darkest, sootiest corner of the old watch, and their observation posts the deep shadows under ancient arches. Opposite the boundless palace square, each new hour brought new observations, ever more gloomy and hopeless. Slowly, like pieces of broken glass, they formed into a single, frighteningly coherent mosaic, a picture of total, irreversible decay, carefully hidden beneath a thin, fragile, spiderweb-thin mask of ostentatious order. With the first, timid rays of dawn, which only slid over the tarnished gilding of domes, powerless to revive it, Ogrim would already occupy his invisible post. He stood at the tavern's narrow, dusty window, gazing at the square. His eyes, accustomed for years to withstand the fierce light of a forge and discern in red-hot metal the tiniest cracks, now with the same stubborn, methodical attention studied the iron rhythm of palace life. He saw the changing of the guard. This was not a simple rotation, it was a precise, soulless mechanism, timed to the second. Exactly on the hour, without a single word or haste, new guardsmen took up posts. Their faces, hardened by winds and indifference, expressed nothing. Neither boredom, nor weariness, only a cold, years-honed vigilance devoid of any thought. Tarnished armor sat on them impeccably, and each glance cast down at the bustling crowd was like a quick, assessing blow, precise, merciless, and final. Ogrim slowly turned his gaze from the window, turned to his companion sitting in the semi-darkness, and his low voice sounded in the silence with the bitterness of old, useless knowledge. The guard is in perfect order. They guard themselves meticulously. Daryl and his trackers, whose natural, animal keenness was honed by long years of hunting and survival in wild lands, watched the counselors, those gray cardinals of power, unwaveringly. They learned to distinguish them not only by faces, but by the subtlety of almost worn embroidery on their tarnished robes, and by the remnants of former, unshakable arrogance in their bearing. Minor, insignificant counselors passed through inconspicuous wickets, their faces frozen stone masks, utterly detached from the surrounding world. They noticed neither the crowd beating at their feet nor the stinking smells, as if floating in another, parallel world woven only of dry prescriptions and countless decrees. Any, even the most timid, attempt to approach them was instantly and soundlessly cut short. Guardsmen appeared, as if from under the earth itself, their hands already resting on the hilts of short swords. Thorian, with his youthful, inconspicuous appearance, would slip closer to the service. Utility gates. He saw how carters delivering supplies to the palace, heavy sacks of grain, oak barrels of wine, huge ox carcasses were subjected to the most thorough, meticulous search. Every sack was opened, every barrel tasted and tapped with special hammers, every carcass inspected from all sides, long, thin probes stuck into the meat. The guards worked silently and in unison, like well-oiled parts of one huge mechanism. They could not be bribed. Any attempt to slip a coin was met with such an icy, murderous in its contempt gaze that the most brazen carter's knees would buckle. Every step, every breath, every movement was controlled literally. Finn, remaining in the stifling tavern, listened, absorbing the sounds of this alien world. His ears, honed by years of life in boundless steppe silence, ticked from the general deafening roar fragments of others' lives and fates. He heard retired, battle-grade soldiers speak of the palace guard with bitter, involuntary respect. Stone devils, even death herself with her sight wouldn't approach them. He learned of the quiet path, vague, smoke-like rumors of a hidden door in an old, abandoned garden behind the eastern wall, but all who tried to use it vanished without a trace, as if dissolving into air. On the evening of the 6th day, as the sun faded behind the crenellated walls, they gathered in their cramped, stuffy room under the very roof. The air in it was thick and heavy with the smell of old, rotted wood, dust, and their own unwashed, hard-won weariness. Their discipline is steel, measured to the millimeter, Ogrim stated dully, strangled, gazing at the ceiling where cockroaches crawled. Not a single crack, not the slightest slack. Trying to bribe them is like trying to buy stone from a rock. The counselors, those shadows by the throne, live in a high tower woven from decrees and circulars alone, Darrell added, his fingers unconsciously clenching and unclenching the hilt of his dagger. You cannot reach them, cannot shout to them. They breathe only the dust of parchment and the smell of molten sealing wax. Provisions, everything brought to the palace, is inspected as if every apple might be filled with deadly poison, Thorian said quietly, almost in a whisper, clutching his knees. Not a mouse, not a cockroach could slip in unnoticed, and all roads, all paths leading inside, are either locked with heavy bolts or a death trap for an uninvited guest, Finn whispered, and his one hand convulsively gripped the edge of the rough blanket. They sat in heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the street's distant roar and the creaking of floorboards. The picture formed from their observations was clear as day and immeasurably disheartening. The palace, that eternal symbol of unassailable might, proved not a rotting, worm-eaten oak, but an impregnable, polished to a blinding sheen granite cliff carved by centuries of unwavering discipline. All known, all conceivable paths were tightly blocked. A direct, desperate assault would be pure, unadulterated madness, deception, cunning impossible, for vigilance knew no sleep. They had run into a stone, cold wall of flawless order, the only thing still working in this dying empire, or, more likely, making a flawless show of working. And this wall seemed absolutely impregnable. And so they sat in their stuffy hovel under the very roof, and thoughts heavy as lead floated in the air thick with dust, sweat, and all-consuming despair. 6 long days of fruitless observation had left them not a single chink, not the slightest, tinper-sized hope. The stone fortress of the palace stood unshakable, and only one path, dark, unknown, and mortally dangerous, loomed in their minds like a phantom, that very quiet path, the eastern door in the abandoned garden. To go altogether, in a crowd that is certain, instant death, Darrell said darkly, hammering each word. Any nose, any misstep will draw the guard, and they'll cut us down like a pack of stray dogs right at the goal, unheard. One must take the risk, go to certain death, Grim agreed, and his voice was muffled, like an underground thud, like the beating of his own heart on the eve of inevitable execution. One who is light of foot and quiet as an autumn leaf falling to earth, but even one, even the most agile and silent, it's still like throwing a lone stone into a bottomless, dark well. Will they hear us up there? Will there be an echo? Despair, heavy and sticky as tar, had already begun to envelop their hearts, filling every crack in their souls, and it seemed one more moment and the last dying ray of hope would go out forever, leaving them in utter darkness of hopelessness. And at that very moment, the darkest before dawn, Grim, mechanically sliding his weary gaze over the dust-covered, grease-smudged window pane, suddenly froze as if struck by lightning, his mighty, scar-etched hand lying on the tabletop clenched into a white-knuckled fist so tight the knuckles, whitened like bone. His breath caught, stuck in his chest. He uttered not a single sound, but all in the stuffy room fell silent at once, sensing the sudden thunderbolt among clear sky tension radiating from him in a dense, almost tangible wave. He saw her. It was Elodie, the very one whose image he had carried through all circles of hell, whose face was the last he saw before sleep, and the first upon waking. As if torn by a sudden hurricane, Grim lunged from his place, knocking aside the bewildered Elric. The wooden chair overturned onto the dirty floor with a deafening crash. He saw nothing around now, not the frightened, gaunt faces of his comrades, not the low, oppressive ceiling beams. The only thought, furious, all-consuming, and blind, was to reach her, to touch her, to make sure this was not a mirage born of pain and weariness. He smashed through the rickety, creaking tavern door with his mighty shoulder without slowing his run, and burst out onto the dusty pavement, into the human sea, where that one, hard-won image had flashed and vanished. Grim crashed into the crowd, not feeling his feet under him, not hearing the indignant cries and curses of surprised passers-by pushed aside by his bare strong chest. He saw only them, the two of them, as if the rest of the world had dissolved into mist. Elodie, she walked, but this was not that light, airy creature whose silvery laughter once rang over the meadows of the far bank, filling the world with light. Each step came to her with visible, agonizing effort, as if invisible, but heavy as lead chains dragged behind her emaciated, wasted legs. Her dress, once light, the color of summer sky, was now rags of dirty, sweat-stained road grime-soaked cloth barely covering her withered, exhausted body. Her hair, that very color of ripe, golden rye, was tangled into a lifeless, dull mat, matted and stiff from sweat, dust, and, perhaps, tears. But worst of all, far worse than any wound, was her face. It was pale as first snow on a moonlit night, and her eyes, once so clear and lively, looked somewhere deep within herself or through the surrounding world, not seeing or noticing it. In them was not a spark of joy, not a shadow of fear, not even a weak glimmer of recognition, only a deep, bottomless, soul-chilling emptiness in which, it seemed, all that was living had died, except for a smoldering somewhere in the very depths spark of something hard, inhumanly cold, and ruthless. She was a living ghost, a shadow walking in sunlight, a mute and terrible reproach to all that had been irrevocably destroyed and defiled. Beside her, not a step behind, moved a Cogit. His tall, naturally lithe and graceful frame was hunched not so much from weariness as from the unbearable weight of an invisible, oppressive burden. Thick, silky fur, once meticulously groomed, was now disheveled and covered in a thick layer of gray street dust, with dry blades of grass and clinging burdock thorns stuck in it. His large, keen, mobile ears were pressed tightly to his head, not in fear, but in silent, furious alienation from all this noisy, hostile world. Golden, honey-colored eyes with narrow vertical pupils, like those of a great steppe eagle, darted short, sharp, blade-like glances around, picking out and analyzing every minute detail, every passing human, but in their very depths lurked not the wild malice of a beast, but a grim, hard-won wisdom forged in the crucible of unspeakable horrors and losses, and the same as Elodie's icy, unbending resolve born in the flame of inexpressible terrors and losses. On his wrists, where once artfully crafted combat bracelets had gleamed, were now only dark, fur and skinning grown bands, mute, but eloquent traces of bonds from which he had, by all appearances, freed himself only recently. At the cost of incredible effort, they walked along Al-Marion's bustling street, these to the ghost girl and the shadow warrior, and from them, from their silent figures, emanated such cold, bone-penetrating despair and such mute, restrained fury that even the most indifferent, self-absorbed townspeople involuntarily gave them wide berth, unconsciously sensing the invisible, a ghastly seal of death and unyielding, steely will emanating from them. They were a living, breathing testimony to that very storm already raging in the east and implacably advancing here. And in their silent, sorrow-filled procession was a terrible, exhaustive tale requiring not a single extra word. A grim caught up with them amidst the seething human sea, and his calloused, old burn and callous-scubbered palm, accustomed to feeling the weight of a mighty smith's hammer, settled on Elodie's fragile shoulder with such tenderness and caution, as if touching a fallen, fragile petal. The girl shuddered all over as if from a touch of red-hot iron, but did not turn, only slowly, overcoming some invisible, internal resistance, transferred her empty, detached gaze to his bearded, gaunt face. In her eyes, once clear and deep as forest lake waters on a windless day, flashed not a spark of joy, not a shadow of surprise, only a weak, fading, last sunset glimmer of something long and hopelessly forgotten, like a ray of light struggling through the thickness of murky, perennial ice. Elodie escaped him, and his voice, always so resonant and commanding at the anvil, trembled, broke, and cracked, becoming a quiet, strained whisper. He saw everything, every terrible detail, the waxen, deathly pallor of her skin, the frozen, mask-like immobility of her face, and that terrible, heart-rending metamorphosis that had turned a living, blooming girl into this silent, detached semblance of a human. The Cogit froze in a low, ready-to-pound stance, every muscle of his lithe body expressing ultimate concentration and readiness for a lightning attack, and in his narrow-slit pupils flared a cold, predatory, warning gleam. But, instantly assessing the situation and sensing no direct threat from a grim, he merely straightened his hunched shoulders slightly, and his pressed back ears twitched, catching and analyzing every sound in the street's deafening din. "Not here," a grim said hurriedly, strangled, his gaze anxiously sliding over the faces of passers-by beginning to gather curiously. "Come with me. To the inn, the old watch. There are our own, ours." He took a step, drawing them after him back towards the dark, inconspicuous entrance, and, lowering his voice to a suppressed, barely audible whisper, continued, now addressing more the Cogit, whose attention was wholly riveted on his words. "The palace. They will not let you in. Not at all. Caring where you're from and what you've seen, endured. They'll drive you away as they drive away lepers, fearing contagion. Your truth It is more frightening to them now than any raised sword. It shatters their calm, deceptive little world. In the Cogit's eyes flashed quick, bitter, stern understanding, devoid of any illusions. Elodie, however, seemed deaf and blind to his words, completely immersed in her own, inaccessible to anyone depths and visions. But we seek a way, a grin gestured with a resolve-filled motion towards the low, dark, mouth-like opening in the stone wall above which a crooked, rust-chained old watch creaked. Anyway, to break through to them, to those hiding behind walls, to force them to listen, if only for a moment, to tear themselves from their scrolls. You saw it with your own eyes. You know what is happening there. Your testimony. It could tip the scales, break the course of thought in their heads. With these words, he pushed the heavy, time and weather-cracked oak door, and from the open gap wafted the thick, stale, poisoned air of the tavern, a suffocating mix of sour ale, scorched fat, sweat, and mute, wall-ingrained human anguish. When the door slammed shut behind them with a dull, final thud, cutting off the street's deafening roar, a ringing silence fell for a moment in the thick, smoke and sour beer-smelling gloom of the tavern, broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace. And then, from the very darkest corner where their companion sat, came a stifled, broken by a surge of feeling cry. Elodie. It was Finn's voice, hoarse with disbelief and suddenly flooding long-awaited hope. The next moment, he and Thorian sprang from their seats, as if tossed by an invisible spring. Their chairs overturned onto the sticky, filthy floor with a deafening crash. But they noticed nothing around. They rushed to her, and their hands, trembling and clumsy, encircled her thin, almost weightless shoulders, clutched at the dirty, stiff fabric of her dress, pressing her to themselves so tightly, so desperately, as if afraid she would crumble to cold dust in their hands any moment. We thought we'd lost you forever," Thorian whispered, and his voice betrayed him, trembling, revealing all the depth of despair and fear accumulated in his soul all those long, endless days and nights. They embraced her, this living but so lifeless shadow of their happy past, and their shoulders shook slightly from suppressed sobs. But Elodie remained motionless and cold in their embrace, like a doll carved from ice. Her hands hung limply along her body, not returning the touch. Only when the first impulsive, joyous exclamations died down, giving way to heavy silence, did she slowly, almost mechanically, without a single word, free herself from their arms. Her gaze, empty and dry as a desert, slid over the face of the Cogit standing slightly apart, still as watchful and silent as a rock. "This is Mercil," her voice sounded, quiet, even, and lifeless, devoid of any intonation, as if she were reading words from a long-memorized and hated scroll. "Son of the chieftain of the Desert Wind tribe, whom the shaman." She fell silent, sharply cutting herself off mid-sentence, and her gaze sank again into the pattern of cracks on the dirty floor, as if seeking in them an answer to an unspoken, tormenting question. Her fingers, thin and wasted, convulsively gripped the rough edge of the table, knuckles whitening from tension. "We must tell the shaman's plan. I heard it when he..." Her voice trembled, for the first time sounding like a weak, distorted echo of long-buried but living pain. "When they were tearing Miko apart." A heavy, oppressive pause hung. The air in the tavern grew thick, heavy, and icy, as in a crypt. "Tearing Miko apart?" A grim asked quietly, but distinctly, driving each word in like a nail. Each word came to him with incredible effort, echoing with pain in his heart. "They killed him." Elodie slowly, with visible effort, shook her head, not raising her eyes, fixed on one point. "No," she whispered, and in that single word was an abyss of such mute, soul-chilling horror that all present felt a chill inside, and the blood drained from their faces. "They sacrificed him, and then tore him apart." At these terrible words, her lips closed into a thin, white, lifeless line, and before her inner eye again, as if in reality, tasked that nightmarish picture Elodie had seen from the cage, unable to look away. She did not burst into tears, did not break down, did not faint. Instead, her face froze into a stone, impenetrable mask of stoic horror, and in the depths of her bottomless, tear-dried eyes, on which moisture had long dried up, like steel, polished grains in icy water, surfaced and froze forever anew, terrible in its finality and irrevocability oath. It was not spoken aloud, did not require announcement, but everyone looking at her in that moment felt its iron weight of vow, vengeance and truth, forged in the crucible of inexpressible sufferings, from which there was now and could be no retreat, until the very end. A heavy, thick silence hung in the tavern, motionless and oppressive as water in a deep forest pool, where not even bubbles rise. It absorbed all sounds: the quiet creak of floorboards under someone's hesitant steps, the distant, muffled roar of the great city beyond the thick walls, Finn's ragged, stifled breath as he sat with closed eyes, as if trying to escape the ghastly reality. Elodie's words about Miko being torn apart still hung in the stale, smoky air like poisonous miasmas, poisoning the very possibility of hope and faith in the gods' mercy. Agrim was the first to break this oppressive, all-consuming silence. Rising from his place, he seemed even more massive and fearsome in the semi-darkness. His shadow, like a granite boulder, blocked the dim, flickering light of a tallow candle, throwing giant, wavering outlines on the walls. Silently, with a face turned into an impenetrable semblance of a stone statue of ancient sorrow, he brought to clay bowls of stew, murky, cold, and tasteless, with yellowish, congealed circles of fat floating on the surface. Elodie did not stir, did not blink an eyelash, as if turned to a statue carved from tale, lifeless marble. Mercil only briefly, almost imperceptibly nodded with that empty, detached politeness that befalls a proud beast broken and tamed by adversity. No one touched the food. The very thought of food, of swallowing, now seemed blasphemy, a desecration of the memory of those whose bodies had become dust and whose souls, perhaps, had found no rest. The palace, Daryl finally spoke, breaking the silence, and his voice, usually firm and resonant as a steel strike, was now quiet, hoarse, like the grating of stone on stone deep in a cave. He broke a dry, stale bread crust in his long fingers, and that dry crunch echoed in the ringing silence like the ominous crack of breaking bones. We searched for a way in for 6 days, for the living, for those who came with petitions, pleas for help. But there is none. There never was for such as us. He raised his heavy gaze, and his glowing eyes, those pale, dying embers in the ashes of former might and grandeur, slowly swept over those gathered, lingering on each face. But even the most impregnable fortress, even the proudest and highest castle, has its depths, its underground, sun-hidden rivers that silently carry away what is not spoken of in daylight, what is washed away and hidden from the eyes of noble lords, so as not to defile their pure and lofty gaze. Thorian involuntarily winced, and over his youthful, not yet coarsened face passed a shadow of natural, deep revulsion. "Devours," he whispered, and in his voice was bewilderment and slight horror. "But that is the only door guarded by neither swords nor eyes." Daryl cut him off sharply, almost angrily. In his suddenly strengthened voice sounded familiar steel again. "For no guardsman, whose mind is not utterly addled, will stick his proud nose into that stinking mess. And we—" He gave a bitter, soundless smile, and in that smile was despair turned inside out, transformed into resolve. "And we are out of our minds. We are those who have nothing left to lose but our chains and this cursed truth. This city, this Al-Marion, is a child of the dwarves, their greatest creation," he continued, and in his tone suddenly sounded unexpected notes of strange, almost reverent admiration mixed with the bitterness of irretrievable loss. "Every stone here, from the very pavement under our feet to the peak of the tallest spire, was once fitted with that mathematical, flawless precision available only to their stubborn, wise, and patient race. They did not build their strongholds on shifting sand or marshes. They inscribed them into the very flesh of the world, creating perfect, living systems where all is interconnected, and all serves a single, great purpose. The Palace of Three Crowns, the crown of their engineering genius, and it could not exist without an equally flawless and well-conceived drain. They did not fling waste over the wall, as do the present, craft-forgotten masters. No, they erected underground, in stone walls, a whole invisible and eternal city, a whole network of stone arteries where the water itself obediently and inexorably carries away all filth and refuse. And one of these arteries, I am certain, must lead right to the very heart of power, to the cellars where ancient wines are stored, to the kitchens where delicacies for the nobility are prepared, to the baths where they wash their noble bodies, to where the feet of the parade guard do not tread, guarding only the shining halls." Agrin nodded darkly with understanding, and his gaze, heavy and piercing as an awl, fell on his faithful hammer lying nearby on the bench. The haft was worn smooth and shiny by years of his callous palm's touch. "Filth can be washed away with water," he growled, and in his voice was not rage, but cold resolve. "Shame cannot. If this path is the only one left, then we shall crawl, like worms, groveling in filth. But we will crawl through, we will deliver. I will go with you, Thorian said unexpectedly but firmly and clearly. His voice did not tremble, though youthful, sickly pallor did not leave his gaunt face. All gazes, heavy and assessing, turned to him. I am light, and quiet, and my arm. He nodded briefly at his sling. It hardly troubles me now. I can crawl where your strength and height would only be a hindrance. Darrow looked at him attentively, long and appraisingly, seeing now not a frightened boy but a grown man in whose eyes burned an even and unquenchable fire, tempered in the crucible of irreparable losses. Then he nodded, briefly and clearly, without extra words. Good. The three of us will go. He rose to his full considerable height, and his shadow, long and angular, fell on the wall, fissured and soot-stained. I know where to start. On the river bottom embankment, where all this city's drains merge into one black, stinking, churning sea, there is an ancient, forgotten collector. The dwarves built it, and the present, unworthy city masters sealed it shut, forgetting its existence. But stone, even the strongest, yields to strength and perseverance. His gaze slid over Ogrim's mighty hammer, and we have the very key capable of unlocking any, even the strongest door. The rest wait here, in this hovel, Ogrim ordered, sweeping a commanding gaze over guard, Alaric, Tailfin, and the silent as shadows trackers. In his voice sounded not a request, but an iron command forged in the fire of battles and losses. Keep silent as the grave. Do not show yourselves. If in a day our shadows do not cross this threshold again. He did not finish, leaving the phrase hanging in the air. But each in the stuffy room felt a chilling cold slowly running down their spine. And at that very moment, when the decision seemed already made, Mercil raised his head. The movement was barely noticeable, only a light, almost weightless turn of the neck. But in it one could guess the wild race inherited from distant ancestors, not killed even by the deepest despair. His golden eyes, whose pupils narrowed in the tavern's darkness to thin, blade-like slits, stared into the emptiness before him, as if seeing through the thick walls and vast distances what was invisible to others, mortals. His large, keen ears, covered in worn, matted fur, quivered almost imperceptibly, catching not some specific sound, but the very echo of a distant, invisible threat. I know the scent of stone, he whispered, and his voice was quiet as the slide of a paw on sand. But each word fell on the ear with frightening, distinct clarity, and the whisper of water in darkness. My ancestors have hunted in the deepest cave since time immemorial, where light was betrayal, and utter, absolute silence the only ally. I will guide you. My eyes and my hearing sense this world differently than yours. He looked at no one in particular, his hunchback still expressing all the weight of endured losses, but in his quiet, measured words was neither request nor plea. It was a simple statement of fact, cold and indisputable, as a verdict of fate. His fallen, broken spirit had found, at last, a point of support in the very darkness, in that very gloom awaiting them ahead. This path, dirty and humiliating, was his element, a kingdom of eternal silence, primal instinct, and deaf shadows, where human strength and even half-elven keenness could prove helpless before the silent, ancient traps of forgotten tunnels. Darrow froze for an instant, his glowing, night predator eyes darting from Thorian's youthful, resolve-inflamed face to Mercil's hunched, silent, as if carved from granite sorrow figure. The air in the tavern seemed thick and heavy, as if soaked in syrup, filled with the acrid smell of cheap, burnt ale, damp, crumbling plaster, and thick, almost tangible human despair. Every minute detail in this wretched refuge, from a deep crack on a clay mug to the frozen, impenetrable mask on Elodie's face, silently screamed of the fragility of their last, desperate hope. Good, Darrow finally said, breaking the heavy pause, and in his voice sounded that very quiet, joyless, and final resolve that descends upon a warrior before the last, mortal battle, when all cards are already dealt. He turned to Thorian, and his palm, covered with a network of old, whitish scars, settled on the youth's thin shoulder, not as a gesture of approval or fatherly pride, but as a silent, full of respect acknowledgment of his courage. That very fragile but unbending courage, born and tempered only in the crucible of irreparable losses. You will stay here. Your turn will come yet, he said. And in these simple, stripped words lay all the stern wisdom of a seasoned commander, knowing the value and place of each fighter in his army. But Mercil, his penetrating gaze fixed on the Cogit, whose motionless figure in the semi-darkness seemed the very embodiment of ancient, wild, and inconsolable sorrow. He will come with us. He will not only guide us through the city's stone gouts. His testimony, what his eyes have seen in the inferno, will outweigh on the scales of fate any, even our bitterest words. Mercil slowly, with visible effort, raised his heavy head. His golden eyes, like metal molten in a furnace, met Daryl's intent gaze. In them was no shadow of agreement, no spark of protest, only a deep, bottomless, and unshakable certainty that the path they were to take was long since predestined by fate, and brooked no discussion. His large, keen ears, covered in worn, matted fur, quivered slightly, catching the distant, barely audible but ominous noise of the great city. That very roar that sounded like the death rattle, gurgling wheeze of a dying colossus. Time slips away like water through fingers, Ogrim spoke, lifting his colossal hammer with a dull thud. The sound of his voice, low and thick like the rumble of an underground tremor, made even the most stagnant tavernaire shudder and stir. Every moment of delay is another life thoughtlessly given to the hordes at our shattered borders. We move out. Now. He took a decisive step towards the exit, his bare strong figure completely blocking the doorway, and for a moment it became truly dark in the tavern, as if the sun had forever hidden behind a storm cloud. Daryl, without another word, soundlessly followed him, his long, worn cloak dragging silently over the sticky, filthy floor. Mercil rose from his place last. His movement was fluid, soundless, and unnatural, like a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He did not look back at the motionless Elodie, did not cast a farewell glance at those remaining in the tavern. His gaze, heavy and concentrated, was directed only forward, into that utter darkness awaiting them beyond the threshold, into those very underground, forgotten by all labyrinths, where the air promised to be thick with the smell of damp, slime-covered stone, and age-matured sewage. The three stepped out onto the street, and the dull, sickly light of evening Al-Marion struck their eyes after the deep gloom of the tavern, making them squint momentarily. The air here was completely different, not stale and saturated with musty despair, but heavy, acrid with street dust, smoke from thousands of hearths, and a distant, barely perceptible, but no less nauseating smell of quiet decay. Slowly rising from the river's surface, they moved along a narrow, dark alley, treading on uneven, slippery cobblestones between which here and there grew tough, gray as ash grass. High, time-leaning houses loomed over them from both sides, as if threatening to collapse any second and bury them under their rotting debris. Ogrim walked ahead, his hammer slung over his mighty shoulder, casting a long, grotesquely distorted shadow on the walls. Each of his steps was firm, confident, and heavy, but deep in his eyes, warily sliding over dirty, curse-graffitied walls, was a deep, years-accumulated weariness, heavier than any hammer. He thought of the far bank, of shadows dancing on ash, of the faces of those he would never see again, and with each such thought, bitter and burning, his fingers clenched the familiar hammer half tighter and more fiercely, as if all his remaining strength and righteousness in the world were contained in it alone. Daryl walked behind, his gaze sharp, attentive, and emotionless, sliding over dark, void-like gateways, over figures hurrying about their insignificant business. He noticed absolutely everything: the suspicious gleam of others' eyes in deep shadow, the unnatural, sepulchral silence in this or that side alley. His ears, slightly keener than a human's, caught fragments of others' conversations drifting from behind shutters, full of mute fear and dull distrust. He felt with every cell of his being how the city was slowly but inexorably dying, and this dying was like a long, agonizing death rattle stretched over years. In this universal agony, their small, wretched party was but one of many nameless grains of sand, powerlessly carried by the wind of coming changes. Mercil walked last, his tread soundless, his lithe body moving with that innate, predatory grace not broken even by inhuman sufferings. His golden eyes, narrowed to slits, attentively studied the road, seeking the slightest, insignificant details: fresh tracks on the dusty pavement, suspicious stains on walls, the barely perceptible direction of the wind. He did not think of the past, for the past was for him an unhelling, eternally bleeding wound. He did not think of the future either, for the future seemed hazy and carrying only new, even more terrible threats. All his being, all his will, were now concentrated on the immediate present, on that single goal to guide these to through the stench of the city's drains, and perhaps only in this find his last, exhaustive meaning for continued existence. Soon they reached the river bottom embankment. The air here changed drastically, becoming thick, damp, viscous, and openly, nauseatingly foul, The smell was complex, layered, almost tangible in it, aromas of rotting seaweed, human and animal waste, rusty metal, and something else, inexpressibly old, dead, and putrid, were horribly and strangely mixed. The water in the river was dark, almost black, oily, and slowly, lazily, hopelessly rolled its turbid, poisoned waters under the gloomy arches of ancient, half-ruined bridges. On the opposite shore, like a mockery, loomed the bulks of the shining palace walls, their crenellated tops lost in the evening's dirty haze. They seemed now so distant, unattainable, and alien, as if located in another, parallel, and hostile world. Darrell halted by a massive, rust-and-centuries of filth-encrusted grate set into the damp stone masonry of the embankment. Behind its interlaced bars gaped absolute, impenetrable blackness, from which breathed bone-chilling cold and the thick, suffocating smell of age-old mold and decay. "Here it is," Darrell said quietly, almost in a whisper, and his words hung in the stale air, as if also afraid to disturb the gloom. "The entrance to the true kingdom of filth and sewage. Are you ready to descend into the very belly of this dying city, to try and heal its rotting heart?" Grim, without a word, stepped heavily to the grate. He ran his coarse, scar-etched palm over the cold, rusty bars, feeling under his fingers their rough, scaly surface covered with layers of time, moisture, and something inexpressibly repulsive. Then he stepped back a pace, planted his feet firmly, grounding himself, and raised his hammer. Mighty muscles on his broad back and shoulders tensed like taut steel springs, ready to uncoil with irresistible force. In the ringing silence of the embankment, broken only by the dismal splash of turbid water and the distant, piercing cries of crows, his low, subterranean voice sounded especially weighty and ominous. "Stand back!" Darrell and Mercil, without hesitation, retreated into deep shadow, under the arch of an ancient, moss-grown bridge. Grim swung his hammer, and it described a heavy, dead arc in the damp air, whistling with a crushing hiss. The blow was terrible in its deceptive simplicity and, inhuman might not fast, but inexorable as the strike of fate itself. A dull, ear-rending crash, like a thunderclap born in the very bowels of the earth, rolled across the deserted embankment, startling a flock of alarmed crows from the cornices of nearby ruins, their anxious, hoarse cawing mixed with the long, fading echo. The rust-eaten, time-undermined iron could not withstand thick bars bent inward with a tortuous, grating sound, and in the very center formed a yawning hole like a fresh, ugly wound. A second blow, delivered at a calculated angle, precise and crushing, finished off the old, decrepit structure. The grate, with a deafening, death screech, as if crying out in final pain, tore away from the stone and with a dull, gurgling splash crashed into the black, oily water, raising a high fountain of foul, dark spray that spattered the embankment stones in thick, sticky blotches. Now before them gaped a black, almost tangible void, from which breathed icy, stagnant air, motionless and heavy as lead, smelling of damp stone, age-old mildew, and something inexpressibly ancient and corrupt, as if death itself had exhaled right into their faces. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.